In the modern world, we ride the crest of a wave. Every day, innovators discover new and better ways of meeting our needs. The greatest innovations are routinely replicated worldwide, except in education, which has remained stubbornly at anchor while the rest of the world has sailed past it.
In the next hour, policy analyst Andrew Coulson explores why our classrooms have yet to be transformed by a similar wave. The same kind of innovative wave that has revolutionized and improved every other aspect of our lives. We crisscross the globe in our search for answers to the essential question: how do we attain educational excellence? In the Barrio neighborhood of East Los Angeles, a uniquely gifted teacher becomes an unlikely hero, showing his Garfield High School students how to shatter expectations.
He taught us to be strong and to stand up for what you believe in.
Time, 3 seconds.
But the same drive and determination that fueled Jaime Escalante's unparalleled success with the students of Garfield High also proved to be his downfall.
He was setting a precedent.
A lot of the teachers were resentful, and it was very public.
5,000 miles away, in a very different culture, Andrew Coulson finds an amazing similarity in the competitive spirit of a baseball game and what students must do to get into college.
In my case, I stay up all night before exam, maybe during 6 weeks.
Here, in Seoul, South Korea, the fierce competition for entrance to the very best colleges, paired with cutting-edge technology, has propelled a unique educational industry to soaring heights. 95% of all South Korean students attend intensive after-school tutoring sessions called hagwons.
It is a market, it is an entire market, and the consumer, a student, likes the product that is better than any other. So teachers compete within the market to become entertaining and educative at the same time, you know?
For the last 10 years, my whole lecture revenue is over $100 million.
Isolated examples of success and innovation do occur in education, but seldom have such examples been expanded or scaled up to improve the educational systems that serve the masses, that improve the basic quality of life, that lift people out of poverty. Join us as Andrew Coulson explores the challenge of replicating educational excellence in School, Inc.
Major funding for this program has been provided by Rosemarie and Jack R. Anderson Foundation, Prometheus Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Gleason Family Foundation, the Stephen Lana Hardy Foundation.
It's often said that education is different from other fields. And there's one respect in which that's certainly true. But to really see it, we have to stop and step back in time to the late 1970s. Recognize this? It's the original Sony Walkman, introduced in 1979, the first mainstream personal music player. And on the eve of its release, the Japanese media were in solid agreement. They thought it would flop. Sony itself expected to sell only about 5,000 a month. And then a funny thing happened. People kinda liked it. Within 2 years, Sony had sold 1.5 million Walkmans worldwide, sparking similar products from other companies that sold millions more. But that was just the beginning. Every year or two, new and improved models hit the market. To earn enough to buy the original Walkman, you had to work 2 weeks at a typical minimum wage job. And that was for lo-fi sound on cassettes you had to flip over every half an hour. What's really amazing about the rapid spread and improvement of personal audio players is that it isn't amazing at all. It's perfectly normal. Great new gadgets and services are appearing and going viral every day. A decade ago, no one had ever heard of Google. Now they do tens of thousands of internet searches per second. Facebook went from 0 to 500 million members in just 5 years. And the same thing is true outside the high-tech world, in everything from organic grocery stores to disposable diapers. Basically, invent something good, and it gets big. And these days, it gets big fast. But of all the products we make and the services we provide, there's one that stands out as an exception to that overall pattern. One activity in which excellence doesn't spawn countless imitators or spread on a massive scale. And that exception is schooling. For generations, there hasn't been a single innovation in teaching that has transformed classrooms and improved student achievement worldwide. The closest thing to it can be found here, inside this 19th century schoolhouse. Let's have a look. And here it is, the blackboard. For the first 2,000 years of education history, it was hard for teachers to communicate complex visual information to groups of students. Wax tablets, like the one shown in this Greek vase painting, had been around since the 5th century BC, and that's how children learned to write, etching letters into the wax, rubbing them out, and starting over. Useful as they were, they didn't allow teachers to reach the whole class all at once. 20 centuries later, we'd made the great leap forward to these: slate tablets and chalk. Bit of an improvement, certainly they're easier to erase, but it wasn't until the late 1700s that a Scottish schoolmaster named James Pillins had a really clever idea. He took all of those tablets off of students' laps and he hung them together on the wall. Suddenly, every student could see exactly what Pillins was talking about at the same time. In a flash, the blackboard leapt across the Atlantic to the United States Military Academy at West Point. And just a few decades later, it was a common item even in remote rural schoolhouses, like this one. So there's an example of a brilliant educational idea, simple and effective, that took the world by storm in barely a generation. We know it can happen. But that was 200 years ago, and nothing quite like it has happened since. Why haven't our classrooms been transformed by that same pattern of improvement and innovation that we take for granted in every other aspect of our lives? It's not that we haven't tried. Schools have adopted all sorts of new technologies over the years, from projectors to personal computers to smart whiteboards. The trouble is that none of these new inventions has improved outcomes, measurable outcomes, on a global scale. Let's take a look at something. American test scores at the end of high school have been flat since we started keeping track of them all the way back in the early 1970s. And the same thing is true in most other countries as well. Basically, educational quality has been stuck in the era of disco and leisure suits for 40 years, while the rest of the world has passed it by. Classrooms and clothes look a little different now than they did back then, but we've changed the trappings of education without really improving the substance. The best schools haven't grown and taken over the less successful ones. The best teaching methods haven't been replicated on a mass scale. And while our top athletes and pop stars reach huge audiences, our greatest teachers seldom reach more than a few dozen kids at a time, despite all our technological advances. Why not? That's the question at the heart of this series. Why doesn't excellence scale up and spawn imitators in education, the way it does in other fields? We'll travel the globe in search of an answer to that question, and we'll take a few detours along the way, because the shortest route isn't always a straight line. But maybe we're just being impatient. And if we wait a few years, education will catch up to the pace of progress in other fields. After all, the rapid spread of new technologies and ideas, that's an incredibly recent phenomenon, isn't it? To find out, we've come here to Lowell, Massachusetts, because in 1821, it didn't exist. A local map from that year bears the title, A Plan of Sundry Farms, etc., at Pawtucket. For miles south and east of the Pawtucket Falls, this was just agricultural land, incorporated into the nearby town of Chelmsford. The one notable man-made structure was this, the Pawtucket Canal. It bypassed the falls and the rapids below. It allowed lumber and other products to be transported down the Merrimack River from its headwaters in New Hampshire all the way to the shipyards of Newburyport on the Massachusetts coast. Completed in 1796, it was a pretty sweet racket, generating a steady revenue stream from its toll fees. At least it did until 1803, when a more popular competitor opened for business right next door. So the Pawtucket Canal lost its monopoly, and a lot of its business and revenue along with it. As a result, this whole area remained a rural backwater for a generation, population 200. Until, in 1821, something happened that changed all that. This! The owners of the Pawtucket Waterway sold their entire operation, lock, stock, and canal, to the Boston Manufacturing Company. Its founder, Francis Cabot Lowell, had studied textile factories while living in England. Studied a little more closely than their owners seemed to realize. And thanks to his, well, industrial espionage, Lowell was able to recreate a functioning mechanized mill just outside Boston. The machines were powered by belts connected to rotating shafts along the ceiling. Those shafts, in turn, were driven by a massive flywheel in the basement. And in the early 1800s, the way you got one of those great big flywheels up to speed was with one of these. The same kind of water wheel that had been driving grain mills in Europe since the Middle Ages. And that's why, after Francis Lowell's death, his partners brought his mechanized mill design to the Pawtucket Falls. It offered enough power to drive dozens of these wheels. Other entrepreneurs took a chance and followed their lead, and the newly incorporated town of Lowell quickly went from rural backwater to the biggest manufacturing center in North America. Their gamble paid off. Making cotton textiles in automated factories was faster, cheaper, and more precise than doing it by hand. So demand went through the roof. But there was a catch. In order to meet that demand, factory owners had to find thousands of workers willing to take on grueling 12-hour days and 6-day weeks. As it turned out, girls and young women flocked to fill these new factory jobs. In 1836, a mill girl named Hannah Wilson wrote to discourage her friend Mary from coming to Lowell in search of factory work.
I think you're better off where you are, for there's more girls than you can shake a stick at the Lawrence Corporation. Holly Thompson has gone to doing housework at Doc Hubbard's. She can not get in the factory nowhere in Lowell.
Still, the mill owners couldn't rest on their laurels. In order to stay profitable and to stay ahead of the competition, they had to find new ways to boost productivity. And that's why the clever chaps at the Appleton Mill hired an eccentric, vegetarian, teetotaling engineer named Uriah Boyden. They asked Boyden to build them a couple of new improved water wheels. Nothing brilliant about that. The clever part was to promise Boyden that the more efficient those wheels turned out to be, the more he'd get paid. Well, with an incentive like that, Boyden did what any good engineer would do. He started by copying off the smartest kids in class. Boyden studied the latest French water power systems, called turbines, and then modified their intakes and outlets to bump up efficiency. His design performed so well that it blew the old technology out of the water. In the coming decades, mills around the country ripped out their medieval-style water wheels and replaced them with ever more efficient turbines. Productivity just kept rising, and the innovations behind it spread like wildfire. The cost of manufactured goods steadily fell while quality continued to improve. It was the dawn of the American Industrial Revolution. Which brings us back to the reason we visited Lowell in the first place. From our vantage point at the beginning of the 21st century, it certainly seems as though great new ideas and innovations were already scaling up 200 years ago, and that with the exception of the blackboard, education just wasn't keeping up. Not everyone required the benefit of historical hindsight to see that. One man in particular noticed it at the time. He was born in 1796, the same year that the Pawtucket Canal was completed. Became a lawyer, was elected to public office, and eventually served here in the Massachusetts State House as president of the Senate. His name was Horace Mann, and this is how he saw his state's fledgling public school system in 1837.
As the system is now administered, if any improvement in principles or modes of teaching is discovered in one school, instead of being published to the world, it dies with the discoverer. Now, if a manufacturer discovers a new mode of applying water or steam power, the information flies over the country at once. The old machinery is discarded. The new is substituted.
Sound familiar? Like us, Horace Mann was frustrated that the common schools, as public schools were then known, weren't enjoying the same spread of innovation that he was seeing happen all around him in places like Lowell. And so he resolved to do something about it, to find a way to make educational excellence go viral. In 1837, Mann closed his law practice, resigned his seat in the state legislature, and became the first head of the first state board of education in the country. From that position, he changed the course of American history. But to understand the plan that he came up with, we first have to understand what education was like during Mann's time. There were common schools all across New England, but there was no state or federal authority dictating what they taught or who could teach. It was parents who hired the teachers and often picked the textbooks as well. In fact, to save money, families sometimes billeted the teachers in their own homes. So if little Johnny couldn't read, figuring out why might be as easy as walking into the next room. But all that parent power came at a price, literally. If you sent a child to public school in the early 1800s, they sent you something that looked like this, a bill. Local education taxes were levied so that the poorest students could attend at little or no charge, but everyone else was expected to pay tuition fees. In fact, half to two-thirds of common school budgets came from these fees. Since the public schools weren't giving education away for free, parents had an incentive to hop in the carriage and check out what the private sector competition had to offer. And they liked what they saw. Most students in the early American Republic attended private schools. Some of them were large academies enrolling hundreds of students, but many were also run by individual teachers. Anyone who wanted could put out a shingle and solicit paying pupils. And finding them was easy. You could just open up the local paper.
Miss Boardman informs her friends and the public that her spring term for instructing young ladies and misses commenced on Monday, March 11th. Terms for instruction in reading, orthography, chirography, arithmetic, geography, astronomy, English grammar, rhetoric, composition, history, and plain needlework. $8 per quarter.
$8 for 3 months. Still, that wasn't pocket change in the 1820s and 30s, but there were teachers offering instruction for less than half that amount. There were also private school options for the poor with free and reduced price tuition. Those were run by mutual aid societies, religious groups, and tradesmen's guilds. And unlike today, many of the larger private academies received public subsidies, allowing them to reach a wider audience than they otherwise would have been able to. Competition helped too. Just as the opening of the Middlesex Canal put pressure on the Pawtucket Canal operators, the creation of all these new, small, independent schools forced the larger private academies to lower their tuition fees. This jumble of competing private schools didn't use the same textbooks or methods, but it seems to have been effective. Student enrollment and literacy were high and rising, newspaper readership was exploding, and the standard of living was improving from one generation to the next. None of this was lost on Horace Mann or his friend James Carter. It was Carter who spearheaded the creation of the State Board of Education from his seat in the Massachusetts legislature. But before Carter ran for public office, he ran his own private school. He'd seen their growing popularity firsthand. And like Horace Mann, he worried that the common schools were lagging badly. In fact, Carter wrote for the Boston Patriot newspaper that unless something was done,
the academies and private schools will be carried to much greater perfection than they have been, while the public free schools will become stationary or retrograde.
Faced with that prospect, Carter and Mann devised a plan to ensure that every child would have access to the dynamic private education marketplace. Okay, I might have made that last bit up. What they actually did was to try to get everyone out of the private sector and into the common schools. That sounds a little odd when you think about the way they felt about common schools versus private schools as far as performance went, but when you understand the way they thought about parents and government, it begins to make sense. Carter, in particular, thought that the reason private schools performed so well was that elite parents chose them. So if he could get those same elite parents to send their kids to the common schools, well, problem solved. Much as they respected the educational decisions of the nation's elites, they had a pretty dim view of the average parent. Referring to young children, Carter had this to say:
Their whole education, if it may be called by that name, is drawn from parental examples, which are not always the best, and are oftentimes the most corrupt.
Both men thought that it was wisest to take control of education out of the hands of parents and place it into the hands of state-appointed experts and state-trained teachers. Which is why we're here on the Battle Green in Lexington, Massachusetts, site of the shot heard around the world that marked the beginning of the American Revolution. Right across the street from this green, the two reformers kicked off a revolution in American education, creating the first state teachers' college in the country. State teacher training was just one part of their plan. The common school reformers also advocated higher state spending, prohibiting the common schools from charging tuition, and gradually centralizing power here in the state legislature. They believed that that would allow the best pedagogical practices to scale up, bringing them within reach of every child. But there was more to it than that. Horace Mann, in particular, believed that the public schools could transform society for the better. Horace Mann believed in the perfectibility of humanity, and that a well-funded state school system would achieve that perfection. Through his tireless campaigning and inspiring words, he eventually won the hearts of the American people. In the 150 years since, we have expanded and funded the public schools beyond his wildest expectations. Has it worked? Here are a few people who can help us find out.
I've been in banking for about 12 years now. I'm with Wells Fargo.
When I graduated law school and I passed the bar exam, I got a job as the Office of the Federal Public Defender here in LA.
I chose the profession of architecture. I'm currently the Assistant Director of Facilities and Construction for the Los Angeles County Office of Education.
The people you've just seen have a lot in common. It's not just that they're all high achievers with successful careers. Every one of them went to the same public high school. This is Beverly Hills High School, as seen on TV. 98% of its seniors graduate, and virtually all of them go on to college. Every year, 600 of its students take advanced placement courses, and virtually all of them pass. It has more national merit finalists and semifinalists than you can shake a stick at. But this isn't where our illustrious group of high achievers went to high school. Taxi! This is the real alma mater of our illustrious group, Garfield High in East LA.
But in the late 80s, early 90s, there was something magical happening at Garfield High School.
I came into the school in 1988. At the time, it was a 3-year high school.
Garfield High School was a fantastic school while I was there.
There were committed teachers, there were committed students, and committed parents.
Up until the late 1970s, it was a pretty typical inner-city school. Test scores were poor, and the mostly low-income Latino students weren't even offered the most challenging courses.
I would say most of the students in this particular school come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds.
Like, we didn't even know we were poor, right? Like, we had no idea we were these disadvantaged kids and that kind of thing.
But by 1988, more students were passing the Advanced Placement Calculus test here at Garfield than at Beverly Hills High. 1 out of every 4 Mexican Americans who passed AP Calculus nationwide attended Garfield. Why?
Jaime Escalante.
Jaime Escalante.
Jaime Escalante.
Time. 3 seconds.
As a teacher, he was fantastic.
Usted di.
You can talk to a number of students about Jaime Escalante, and they tell you what a wonderful teacher he was.
What I could say today is that he had a major impact in my life.
Each of us remember the great teacher, the one who touched our life.
From the time he started teaching at Garfield in 1974, Jaime Escalante worked as if his life depended on the success of his students.
The mathematics program chair and driven by Mr. Escalante at the time was very rigorous.
There was nothing but excellence expected of us students, hence we had to step up to the challenge.
I did not want to disappoint him, and that's something that I think you'll probably find from other students. We did not want to disappoint Jaime.
By 1982, the results were beyond belief. Literally, his students performed so far above expectations on the AP Calculus test that the Educational Testing Service suspected cheating and threw out their scores. Undaunted, they retook it and came through with flying colors a second time.
He taught us to be strong and to stand up for what you believe in.
Hollywood noticed, dramatizing the story in the movie Stand and Deliver.
This is basic math, but basic math is too easy for you burros. So I'm going to teach you algebra because I'm the champ.
Seeing the movie makes me laugh. It gives me a lot of memories of how it was in the classroom.
The depiction of Mr. Escalante was right on.
You ever been to the beach?
He was a character. From the moment he walked in the door to the hat he wore every single day.
A negative times a negative equals positive.
Some of the things that were so striking in that movie is the fact that he built a relationship with each one of the students. He knew them by name, he knew their story. And that was not an exaggeration. He knew our stories.
One of the things I still admire about him is his ability to continue teaching even after he was famous and he had attention. He was still a teacher at heart, and he taught me everything I needed to be prepared for college.
In art as in life, Escalante had a simple message for his students. With enough drive and hard work, the sky was the limit.
Ganas is something that any of us can attain.
Culturally, it goes to kind of the gut of who you are and your soul.
The lessons I learned from Jaime, I apply them every day. I apply them with my children. And I talk about Jaime, and I talk about the ganas, that you need to have the desire. Nothing's for free. You have to work really hard if you want to achieve anything.
We lived in a community that is generally poor. But we are the most hardworking individuals that you could find. And that's exactly what Mr. Escalante tapped into. The willingness to work and the willingness to find that path.
Certainly his students did well on their high school math tests, but did they retain what they'd learned long enough to build it into successful lives and careers? It's an important question because a lot of technical jobs require math, especially if you're reaching for the stars. This is the Mount Wilson Observatory, high in the mountains of the Angeles National Forest. From this telescope, Edwin Hubble made observations back in the 1920s that dramatically changed our understanding of the universe. Virtually everyone at the time assumed that the universe was static. It was Hubble who showed that it's continually expanding, giving rise to the Big Bang theory for the origin of space and time. Needless to say, for this kind of work, you need a fair bit of math.
I work at JPL. I've been there, actually, I hired there right out of high school. I'm a supervisor of the mechanical integration group. And what we basically do is assemble spacecraft. Mars Science Laboratory is a beast of a spacecraft. It's the size of a Mini Cooper.
Say you wanted to build a laser-packing, rock-analyzing, nuclear-powered robot, strap it to a rocket, and send it to Mars. Would having attended classes with Jaime Escalante in high school have helped get you there?
Getting to his classroom was an incredible experience, and I don't know how far I would have gotten without him. I think my current job had to do with him. I went to college, and in college we had 4 calculus classes to take, 4 levels of calculus, and then there was still another 3 levels of math class above that. In every one of those classes that I took, there was always a subject that I had already learned in Mr. Jaime Escalante's class in high school.
Of course, engineers and scientists aren't the only folks who use math. Nor is Sergio Valdez the only student who benefited from his time in Escalante's classroom. But what good is a fantastic math teacher if you want to pursue a career in fine arts, or journalism, or the law?
I often ask myself, why is it that, even now, I'm 47 years old, it's Jaime that I remember the most. And I think it's because he inspired me the most.
Okay, so Jaime Escalante did have a lasting impact, and it reached beyond the students who were particularly interested in mathematics. But he was only one man, so there was necessarily a limit to the number of students he could reach, right? You might think so, based on the nickname that his students gave him. They called him Chemo, short for...
Chemo sabe.
You Chemo sabe. Chemo sabe?
Chemo sabe is what the Native American Tonto character affectionately called...
The Lone Ranger.
Mr. Escalante was very informal with his students. He was a kidder. He was a joker.
The whole concept of being that familiar with your teacher is probably one of those things that defines the personality of the teacher and the personality of the student.
He made it a point to keep his classroom interested, and humor's one way he did it. And having this nickname, Chemo, and calling his students by nickname was a way that he made that personal connection with them.
It was a pretty cool nickname, but Jaime Escalante wasn't really a lone ranger. He had a posse. Escalante partnered with several other of Garfield's math teachers to create a program that covered everything from basic fractions to advanced calculus.
There were other teachers also that participated and that I had a lot of respect for.
And it was with this team that Escalante created a program bigger than himself, able to produce so many high achievers, even ones who never set foot in his classroom.
Started teaching here at Griffith Junior High, around the corner from Garfield. One of my ex-students, she was taking a class with Escalante. One day she said, Mr. V, you have to meet Escalante because you remind me of him. She arranged the meeting, and I went there, and we sat down after school for an hour or so. We talked, and we clicked. And he said, I want you to come and work with me. I want you to be part of my team.
Louder! A negative equals a negative equals a positive.
Why?
The movie Stand and Deliver ends on a high note, with Escalante's students proving the skeptics wrong. But the story of his mathematics program at Garfield does not have a Hollywood ending. When the film was released in 1988, Garfield's math program was bigger and more successful than ever.
Before I came to Garfield, I had never heard of Mr. Jaime Escalante. But sure enough, as soon as you step foot on campus, you hear about Mr. Jaime Escalante and you hear about the math program.
Every single week, there was a new film crew coming in.
In any other field, we might expect this combination of success, scalability, and publicity to have catapulted Escalante to the top of his profession. Or like Hubble's expanding universe, to have spread all across the country. That just isn't what happened.
My years were the years of controversy, where a lot of the teachers were resentful, and it was very public.
Jaime was a type of person that wouldn't settle for normal goals. He had big dreams, and he wasn't afraid to reach for them.
You know, Jaime was relentless, and he wanted, the best for the students.
The key problem was that Escalante's classes were big.
The number of students in the class worked for him. He could handle it.
He was setting a precedent. He was giving the message to the administrator, if Escalante can do it, why not you? The union helped Mr. Jimenez, who was the other calculus teacher, or helped him to believe that he could run as a chairperson and be the chairperson, which he did. And that was done, in the background. They hide it from Escalante.
The union was able to get the votes to oust Escalante as chairman of the math department because his success and fame had started to arouse jealousy.
Maybe they felt that he had too much power, too much attention given to him and his programs. And, I could see that happening.
Jealousy and union opposition weren't the only problems Escalante faced. He also lost one of his key supporters with the departure of Principal Henry Gradias in 1987. The new principal was Maria Tostado.
And Tostado took over, and she basically was an outsider, did not understand what it implies, the validity of the program, how much it meant to Garfield, to the barrio. She did not apply herself to understand that that was the greatest gift the community had, and never treasure that.
In 1991, demoted and resented by many of his colleagues, Escalante left Garfield High.
I know that when he left, he did not leave in good terms, and to me, it was just tragic. It was just tragic because he was a good man. All Jaime Escalante ever wanted to do was to help us achieve our goals. And if there's anything wrong with that, I don't see it.
It is very difficult for one person or two or three to make an impact that has that ripple effect.
It was amazing stuff that we learned. 20 years later, I know schools have come a long way, but it was still a big challenge. It was still a big achievement. And I'm proud of having been part of that.
Nearly 2 centuries ago, Horace Mann thought he'd found a way to bring the greatest teachers and schools within reach of every child. But as Jaime Escalante's experience illustrates, we still haven't achieved that goal. That's the bad news. The good news is that there are places where educational excellence is scaling up. Which is why our next stop is a baseball game in South Korea. Baseball has one of the heaviest schedules in professional sports, but the Doosan Bears and the Next End Heroes are still giving it their all, despite the fact that this is a midweek game and the skies are threatening to open up any second. Playing ball isn't all fun and games, but it has its perks. The top players on that field are national celebrities, and they earn big bucks because of their skill and their hard work. Wouldn't it be great if the best teachers earned that same remuneration and that same recognition? Well, here in Korea, they do. Okay, not exactly. The top teachers earn more than the highest paid professional baseball players.
My whole lecture revenue is over $100 million.
How is that possible? Well, it's an interesting story, and it reaches back 1,000 years. In 958, Korea's Goryeo dynasty started doling out government jobs to whoever scored highest on a national service exam. The subject matter was mainly Confucian literature and mathematics, and only the ruling elite could afford to prepare their children for it. But it sent a powerful message. Academic excellence was the road to success. It wasn't until the late 1800s that the national service exam was finally abolished, and the Hermit Kingdom, as Korea had been known, finally started opening up to the outside world. But before it got very far on the road to modernization, Korea suffered a 40-year occupation by Imperial Japan, and then the partitioning of the country after World War II, and another 3 years of war instigated by the Communist North. After all that, South Korea was in ruins. Illiteracy was high, the infrastructure had been destroyed, but the nation had two things going for it: economic freedom and the fervent belief that education was the path to prosperity. Schooling exploded, first elementary and then secondary, but the creation of colleges couldn't keep up. So to ration those scarce college places, South Korea rekindled its ancient tradition, introducing a mandatory college entrance exam. Only this one focused on modern subjects and was genuinely open to all. Well, with their children's futures riding so heavily on that single test, Korean parents were keen to provide the best preparation they could. And since they lacked confidence in the public school system, families started looking for alternatives. This was similar to the situation in 19th century America, where most parents opted for private schooling. But here in Korea, there was a twist. The private schools were so heavily regulated that they didn't really look much different from the public schools. So parents decided to opt outside the regular school sector entirely, hiring private tutoring services called hagwons. These hagwons were popular with parents, but they weren't popular with everyone. Government officials in charge of public schooling worried that they would lead to inequality in the education system. And so in 1980, they outlawed most private tutoring. This prohibition on after-school tutoring was every bit as effective as America's prohibition on alcohol. Instead of driving hagwons out of business, the ban drove them underground. They became illegal educational speakeasies, like the illicit drinking establishments of the Roaring '20s. The Korean government even offered cash rewards to anyone ratting out teachers engaged in extracurricular curricula. Despite all this, the private tutoring industry boomed. By the time the ban was struck down 20 years later, the number of hagwons had risen from 5,000 to more than 67,000. With the outright ban on hagwons overturned, the government resorted to a cap on fees, but this too was ruled unconstitutional. Not to be dissuaded, the government set a 10 p.m. curfew on hagwon lessons that remains in place to this day. In place, but not entirely effective.
Actually, my tuition, my hagwon, at that time, we had a time limitation on only 10 o'clock. But they had a program from 10 to 1 o'clock. So what they did, we were studying at 10 o'clock, and we were in the night, we had to finish the lesson, and then they send us all into another restaurant just down below. And then when the police comes, right, they will check around whether this hagwon is ongoing or not. After they went back to their police station, they called us to the restaurant. Okay, now you can come out. Then we come out again, and we had a lesson. And also sometimes we were studying, but by the window, we see a policeman, then we turn off the lights. Then we wait for they across the road, then we again turn it on and we studied. It is illegal. However, parents want it.
Do they ever? 95% of students have taken hagwon lessons by the time they leave high school. It's typical to attend after school several days a week, sometimes well past midnight. And according to one study, 3/4 of students prefer those Hagwon lessons to their regular school classes.
Actually, I think the aim of Hagwon is helping us to get better grades from the school. And for me, actually, Hagwon helped me a lot.
I've seen many students who sleep at school, like all subjects from morning 8 to afternoon 5 p.m. They just sleep. And then when they go to Hagwon, their eyes are so sparkling and they're ready to study. And then they study till 2 o'clock.
Of course it's that way. It's because Hagwons are customer-oriented. When students enroll in Hagwons, they are matched with classes based on their performance level. So it's possible to tailor the lessons to those specific students. But that's not the case for regular public schools, which means the highly advanced students and those who are far behind are in the same classes that aren't really suited to them.
Public schools are divided by age in classes. I think that makes a big difference.
And it's not the only difference.
Schools are places students are required to attend, but they choose to come to Hagwons, so they have more affection toward them. That means they tend to pay closer attention in class, and because of that, it is so fun to teach these kids.
Mr. Choi is a national star. A lot of students have fallen in love with his lectures. In the past, students from outside Seoul had to come take these classes during vacation. But as internet technology improved, kids got the opportunity to listen to great lectures in the comfort of their own homes.
Actually, I'm not from Seoul, I'm from Daejeon, which there aren't really many celebrity teachers, so we have to take online courses. So me and my friends, and we'll be all watching the same teacher's education. I actually met one of them at Seoul train station, and me and my friends from back home were like excited and we wanted to take pictures. He was like a celebrity to us, and he actually helped me with the subjects that I did not really do well on.
I teach around 1,000 students a year in person. As for online, it's around 10 or 15,000 students a year.
Every online lecture has a demonstration lecture. Almost all students should see that first, and then they are free to choose. Online and in-person lectures, on average, over 100,000 students taking my lessons.
It is a market, like it is an entire market, and the consumer, a student, likes the product that is better than any other. So teachers compete within the market to become like entertaining and educative at the same time, you know?
I must study hard, even harder than my students. So the lecture is very enlivened and interesting and exciting.
For online Hagwon teachers, if they deliver passionate lectures and give good service, many students will subscribe to their classes, and their earnings reflect that.
For the last 10 years, my whole lecture revenue is over $100 million, and my share is $25 million. But at this point, the regular schools teachers, if they worked harder, there would be nothing. There could be nothing for their more efforts.
Public high schools, the salary is seniority based, or seniority by age, right? Experience. And even though you teach very well, that usually you're not compensated for that.
Not just in Korea, but also in America. There's nothing like that motivational compensation system.
The best thing about teaching in Hagwons is the freedom it guarantees about everything, as long as I'm doing a good job. But at Hagwons, you must renew your contract every year. If the feedback and surveys from students are not good, you could be let go. It's a sort of carrot and stick approach. You could be let go, or you could be paid more. So Hagwon teachers have no choice but to develop themselves in the best ways they can. There is a book called Professor Farnsworth's Explanations in Biology. It left a lasting impression on me. In that book, he says that everybody has a natural instinct to share what they know. To be able to share the things that you know and get paid for doing that is actually a miracle.
The same freedoms and incentives that are driving the success of Hagwons have also created what people call the miracle of the Han River. Korea's rise in barely 2 generations from a war-torn ruin to, well, this. During the 1960s, average income per person was less than $500 in both North and South Korea. But by the early 70s, the nations began to diverge. The South adopted an open market economy. The North, a centrally planned government system. Today, per capita income is 20 times higher in the South. It's not hard to spot the difference, even from space. The two Koreas at night. The North, a sea of darkness. The South, awash in light. South Korea's new wealth has spawned a proliferation of colleges. This view of Seoul is from the top of the classic 500 building, which itself was built by a university foundation. But though there are now enough college places for everyone, the high-stakes university entrance exam remains, and the competition to score well and attend a top-ranked college is fierce. It's fair to say that Korea's combination of hiring practices, high-stakes exams, and intense education culture have combined to make life pretty tough for students.
In my case, I stay up all night before exam, or maybe during 6 weeks, so I got under pressure a lot.
Traditionally in Korea, the educational level of a person has played a crucial role in determining his or her status in society.
You know, everything is measured by which college you enter. This is not good system. So I think definitely we have too much pressure, right? That's true.
Actually, I find this deeply troubling. I feel that the kids are suffering in this system that is created by adults.
And yet other students seem to take the academic pressure in stride.
If I look back, I think it was not all just study. You know, I had fun with my friends studying, and I kind of enjoyed it. And I wanted to do more to, you know, succeed and do better. And I liked learning. So I think not all Koreans are like, I don't want everyone to pity the Korean students because we study a lot. Sometimes we kind of enjoy it because we are doing it for ourselves.
And it's hard to undo a 1,000-year tradition. But there are signs of change. For one, businesses are finally starting to look beyond elite college degrees when sifting through their applicants' resumes.
In the past, big companies, they were kind of lazy. So they just depend on the screening device. But now they realize that maybe good managers, good employees may not directly have to do with the college diploma.
Korea's challenge is to find a way of easing the pressure on its students while building on the key strength of its Hagwon sector, the ability to bring top teachers within reach of a massive audience. Our challenge is to figure out how they do it. Could it have something to do with the freedoms and incentives of Korea's tutoring sector? Its teachers have tremendous autonomy. They're constantly striving to improve their services to stay ahead of the competition. And the more students they serve, the more money they bring in. All of that's also true of private schools back here in the United States. So if that's the recipe for replicating excellence, we'd expect to see the same kind of growth among US private schools. Do we? Let's find out.
On the next episode of School Inc., Andrew Coulson's journey takes him to one of the top 10 performing private high schools in America to find out why replicating their reputation of excellence is not part of their highly successful traditions. In Austin, Texas, he visits a remarkable charter school system where scaling up and expansion has become a source of community pride. And Coulson visits Chile to ask, what could winemaking and education possibly have in common?
Major funding for this program has been provided by Rosemarie and Jack R. Anderson Foundation, Prometheus Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Gleason Family Foundation, the Stephen Lana Hardy Foundation.
School Inc. is available on DVD. For more information or to order a DVD of this program, call 1-800-876-8930 or visit www.freetochoose.net.
In the modern world, we ride the crest of a wave. Every day, innovators discover new and better ways of meeting our needs. The greatest innovations are routinely replicated worldwide, except in education, which has remained stubbornly at anchor while the rest of the world has sailed past it.
The pace of that modern life seems to provide an almost endless number of choices, some of which can have a far-reaching impact. This seems to be especially true in American public school. But what about independent private schools?
In private schools, you have more autonomy and flexibility. Creativity is valued.
At one U.S. high school, the melding of modern trends and traditional methods has clearly resulted in educational excellence. Michigan's Cranbrook School offers students a unique educational experience.
The first minute I walked into the classroom, I was just astonished by the freedom that students were given, not only in the classroom, but outside the classroom.
This school has fostered more than a love of education, but a love of learning not only through books, but through people.
In Texas, another school is part of an expanding network offering excellence on a grand scale.
What makes KIPP unique is our high expectations and a singular focus on college.
Could the success of this unusual school network hold the secret that could transform educational innovation? And what might a natural disaster and the making of fine wine have to do with schooling? Join us as Andrew Coulson explores the challenge of replicating educational excellence in School Inc.
Major funding for this program has been provided by Rosemarie and Jack R. Anderson Foundation, Prometheus Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Gleason Family Foundation, the Stephen Lana Hardy Foundation.
In our quest to learn how educational excellence can be replicated on a mass scale, Korea's private tutoring sector offers some enticing clues. Its top teachers reach tens or even hundreds of thousands of students. We just have to figure out how they do it. And as long as we're playing detective, it makes sense to look for the means, motive, and opportunity driving that growth. Could it be as simple as choice for families, competition for schools, and freedom for educators? If so, we'd expect to see the same kind of growth among U.S. private schools. College prep schools in particular seem like a prime suspect. They're chosen by parents, and since many accept boarding students, they're in competition with each other nationwide. And in one respect, many prep schools have reached enormous proportions: their physical size. This, for instance, is the 315-acre campus of the Cranbrook schools here in Bloomfield, Michigan. But despite their often spacious grounds, most prep schools serve only a few hundred students. Cranbrook is among the largest, enrolling roughly 1,700 pupils when its lower, middle, and upper schools are taken together. Clearly, there's some missing ingredient, something that Korea's tutoring sector enjoys that America's prep schools lack. But what?
The people that are in the competitive market with us, each are going to offer something unique that fits each individual. I can't imagine that one school could fit every need. We happen to have a place that I think works well for a lot of people.
I come from a family of educators, and most of my family works in public schools. But I felt in private schools, you have more autonomy and flexibility. Creativity is valued, and so the practice of teaching is, at least for me, easier in an independent school.
That's the essence of what I think is a very important differentiator in terms of education. The freedom to hire faculty who you feel will be a good match to the mission of the school and its philosophy.
I always think about how this place started as farmland, and an analogy for me is, how land is cultivated to produce and to yield, its bounty. And working in the classroom with the students here, you're very much able to do that. You are cultivating learners, you are cultivating artists, you are cultivating scientists, you are working with these young people.
Right, we've got an Institute of Science right here, and that staff will make themselves available for getting into the planetarium to give an astronomy class a unique view of retrograde motion of Mars, for example.
Prep schools generally do well on traditional measures of educational outcomes: test scores, graduation rates, matriculation to selective colleges. But we have to put those outcomes in context. These schools are academically selective, so how can we tell how much of their success is due to effective teaching and how much to the bright, highly advantaged students they happen to enroll? One way is to see how students' performance changes from the time they are admitted to their graduating year. The bigger the gain, the greater the school's contribution is likely to be. And that contribution varies from one school to the next, but in some cases, like Cranbrook's, it seems to be substantial. Another way to gauge school quality is just ask students themselves.
The first minute I walked into the classroom, I was just astonished by the freedom that students were given, not only in the classroom, but outside the classrooms, and just the level of trust between the students and the teachers, and how there's so much respect given to the teachers and also so much respect returned. For one of my classes, it deals with the Art Institute, also with the sculptures on campus. We have so many sculptures, so many statues. And so once a week, usually the teacher takes us outside on a mini adventure. It's great.
One side of it is the faculty, which I personally think are fantastic. They're obviously well educated on their subjects. But I think the other side is being surrounded by, kids who are intellectually curious.
This school has fostered more than a love of education, but a love of learning not only through books, but through people.
No single school is right for every child, but this one seems well liked by its students and academically effective. It's easy to see why parents might want to send their children here. Which brings us to another possible reason why prep schools might not scale up: insufficient demand. After all, they're expensive. financial assistance is available, but the full sticker price for day tuition can reach $40,000 a year. Cranbrook is a relative deal at $29,000 for its upper school. But as it turns out, most prep schools have more applicants than they can accommodate. And in addition to having enough demand to justify expansion, prep schools have also had plenty of time for it. Most of them are venerable institutions whose histories and traditions are a key source of their appeal.
This place was given away by a really wealthy family, and this was their land, and they built the school, and they wanted it to serve the community, and they wanted all the community, not just the well-off kids, and that continues today with various programs.
The majority of prep schools can trace their histories back over a century or more. Linden Hall was founded in the 1740s, and Milton Academy the 1790s. By contrast, Korea's tutoring firms didn't debut until the 1970s, and most are more recent than that. Despite that novelty, they've grown explosively. Or maybe because of that novelty. What if the grand histories and traditions of prep schools have made them hidebound? What if they're too set in their ways to adopt the latest technologies? That theory is certainly plausible. It's also wrong. Prep schools have begun to use internet video to reach students beyond their own campuses. The same technology used by Korean tutors to reach tens or even hundreds of thousands of students. But prep schools use it a little differently.
We were among the founding schools of the Global Online Academy. It brings us the capacity to offer our faculty to classrooms far beyond the Midwest. We have students now who are in our own Global Online classrooms here at school, who are in classrooms alongside of students in Hawaii, in Jordan, in Malaysia. Our belief is that online learning will never fill the space that bricks and mortar education holds. We are centrally committed to the presence of faculty and students in one space. We believe that there is no substitute for a student and a faculty being able to sit on two sides of a log and musing.
So prep schools have the quality, demand, technology, and time to grow into national networks. They just don't. We're running out of plausible explanations here, so let's turn to a counterintuitive one. What if they just can't afford it? That may seem unlikely given the substantial fees they charge, but tuition actually fails to cover their full operating costs. Virtually all prep schools raise additional funding for their operating budgets from annual donations. Maybe there just isn't anything left over for expansion. Unfortunately, that explanation doesn't hold water either. In addition to their revenue from annual giving, most prep schools also have large endowments. Over $200 million in the case of Cranbrook schools, and $1 billion in the case of Phillips Exeter in New Hampshire. And yet, the best endowed prep schools don't invest their endowments in national expansion. Why not? One answer is that it would be difficult to preserve the character of these institutions beyond their original locations.
Because our campus is so unique and because the campus is so much embedded as part of the curriculum, that it would be difficult to duplicate that experience and still call it Cranbrook.
But that just begs a deeper question. Why is the focus on sustaining a particular experience rather than on reaching a wider audience? It might have something to do with the reasons people donate to these schools in the first place.
Many times it's based on their own experience, meaning the donors are our alumni. And so based on the alumni's experience, they want to be able to give back to the institution, which helped them, nurtured them, supported them.
So even if their donations could theoretically finance a major expansion, that's generally not what they're for. What we've learned, in other words, is that Sherlock Holmes and friends have it right. It's not enough to find a suspect with the means and the opportunity. They also have to have the motive. And America's prestigious prep schools, though they have many wonderful qualities, simply don't have a motive to scale up. They're striving to perpetuate beloved traditions, not to start national franchises. Which raises an interesting question. What would happen if someone did deliberately set out to replicate educational excellence? That's not a hypothetical question. In fact, it's fairly easy to answer because there already is a large and growing category of schools that philanthropists are trying to scale up. Charter schools. Charters are public schools that are freed from some of the rules and red tape that apply to their regular district-run counterparts. They have more control over what they teach, what methods they use, and how they measure student achievement. Charter schools also tend not to be unionized, which means that principals can hire whomever they want. That's a lot different from traditional public school contracts that allow older teachers to bump younger ones out of a job, no matter what the principal thinks. Of course, it's not all sunshine and roses. Charter schools receive a lot less funding per pupil than traditional public schools, $3,500 less every year. And charters also receive less funding from private sources. And that's where it gets interesting. Charter schools and traditional public schools use their private funding very differently. If your local public school principal does a great job and gets a huge donation, she cannot use that money to open new public schools in other districts. Charter school leaders can. They can create whole networks of schools that share their mission and methods, and philanthropists know that. So when they make donations to charters, it's very often with that replication in mind. And it's working. There are now 130 charter school networks enrolling 250,000 students, and they've been growing in both size and number for over a decade. One of the fastest growing is the Knowledge is Power program, better known as KIPP.
KIPP was founded in 1994 by Dave Levin and Mike Feinberg, who were two young teachers in Houston public schools. They saw what was working in the schools where they were teaching, and they put all the things that they saw into an innovative, kind of experimental one classroom, and that experience led to a lot of success, and they grew that to operate a middle school in Houston and a middle school in New York.
Their goal was to help low-income children gain both the skills and the habits necessary to succeed in college. To do that, they stretched the school day and the school year, raised academic expectations, and studied the methods of the best teachers they could find.
KIPP is different from other schools for many, many reasons. One of the first things that comes to mind is our principals and our teachers. KIPP really innovated in how they train and select school leaders, and that's created a network of amazing leaders who have been given the autonomy and been empowered to run their schools.
Not content to just run their own schools, Feinberg and Levin created training programs for teachers and principals. Everything they learned about success in and out of the classroom was distilled so that it could be passed on to a new generation of educators.
As Mike and Dave ran their schools, they got national attention, and they got to the place where the question was asked, how are we going to replicate this? How are we going to take this nationally? And so they developed a theory of change for our country that really focused at first on the school leader. And they attracted this group of young teachers who wanted to drive change in different cities.
Within a few years, people all over the country were asking them to open schools in their neighborhoods.
So KIPP currently operates in 20 states in the District of Columbia, and we have 183 schools and serve 70,000 students.
Of course, expansion like that costs money, but generous individuals and foundations came forward to make that expansion possible, contributing over $400 million to grow the network.
KIPP Austin was founded as a 5th grade middle school in 2002, and we grew 1 grade each year until we had our first class of 8th graders go off to high school. At that point, we saw the demand in the community, we saw the success of the program for our students, we saw the student achievement levels, and we decided to grow to become K through 12. We've been growing almost about 1 school a year. To this point, we're at 9 schools, 4,400 students, and next year we'll be at 10 schools and 5,000 students.
What is the slope of a line that is vertical, that looks like this?
First group to finish gets the +3, second group to finish gets +1. Go!
We have B, C, and D left.
One of the best things about KIPP is the community we create between parents, teachers, and students. When you go to a KIPP school, you'll see a principal who will make day-to-day decisions based on what's best for kids. That in turn creates an environment where teachers are really able to thrive and do amazing things for our kids.
Teachers at KIPP are different than a traditional school because the teachers care about you. They want you to go to college and want you to succeed.
The teachers are very exciting and very passionate about what they teach. They really enjoy it. You can tell they enjoy it by the passion in their voice and in their eyes and in their movement. And it's good to see people who actually like what they're doing.
My old school is different from KIPP because here in KIPP, teachers care about you more. They want you to master the subject and be able to go to college.
It's different because the teachers really challenge you a lot more than the teachers did before. Because when they teach, they didn't really go over the lesson as the teachers do at this school. When I was at a different school, I didn't feel very challenged because the classwork that they were giving us wasn't really that hard. It was simple stuff that I could do any day. But once I came to KIPP, I felt more challenged because the work was a lot harder than what I was given before.
My old school was different because here at KIPP, the classes are a lot smaller, so teachers get to know you on a personal level.
One thing that KIPP offers that I couldn't get in another school is having a good relationship with your teacher and getting feedback on the work you do. I think KIPP is challenging because they give you hard subjects, but then you can, when the teachers teach you, you can understand it better and you can master it.
Are they succeeding? A recent Stanford University study compared charter school networks, both to each other and to traditional public schools. They found that students are learning more at KIPP. The differences aren't large, but they appear in both mathematics and reading, and other researchers have found similar positive results.
So now that we've made sure that we have the terminology ready to be able to actually...
At KIPP, we believe that all children deserve an exemplary public education. Our mission is to get students to and through college. So regardless of whether our student's an elementary student, a middle school child, or a high school student, we're focused on college, and you see it from their first day. When a kindergartner will enroll at KIPP Austin, one of the first numbers they'll learn is the year they'll go to college. And they'll soon be called the class of 2023 or the class of 2025. They'll visit colleges starting all the way in elementary school, all the way through their high school.
One thing that KIPP offers that you can't get in another school is all of the information about college and all of the focus towards college.
KIPP is different from the school I went to before because KIPP has pushed us more to focus onto college. It has boosted my standards of college that I wanted to go to, way higher than I had before. After I graduate, I would either like to attend Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, or Yale and study chemistry, physics.
Once I finish going to school at KIPP, I am planning on going to college. I'm not sure where yet, but I would like to major in language interpretation and translation.
I would like to study environmental science and music.
What makes KIPP unique is our high expectations and a singular focus on college. Our mission is to get students to and through college.
80% of KIPP graduates have gone on to college. And KIPP graduates aren't just more likely to be accepted into college, they're also much more likely to complete it.
KIPP currently has a college completion rate of 51% for students who completed 8th grade with us. That's approximately 5 times the national average for students from a similar background. Not only do we work with our children to make sure that they apply to the best colleges possible, but we will stay with them and provide support, provide mentorship, provide coaching all the way until they complete college.
Of course, KIPP has its critics, some of whom claim that it only succeeds by cherry-picking the best students. But the Stanford study actually controlled for students' prior test scores, and KIPP kids still learned more. KIPP proves that it's possible to run a successful, popular network of charter schools and to grow it thanks to philanthropic investment. It's doing something that traditional public schools cannot do and that elite prep schools choose not to do.
It's a really good opportunity to come to school here. I really, really enjoy it, and I think it's important for people to come here. I wish that everyone could come here.
The demand in our community from our families for schools like KIPP is extremely high. Next year, when we will be at 5,000 students, we'll still have 2,000 students on our wait list. The students here really feel known for who they are, and the parents really come to trust their teachers, that they're all acting together in the best interest for their child.
But is KIPP's story representative of charter schooling as a whole? To find out, I studied all the charter networks in California, how well they had performed academically, and how much funding they had received from donors. For the broadest possible picture, I looked at both the state's own tests and also the advanced placement tests administered by the College Board. What I found is that the correlation between performance and grant funding is tiny. To put it in perspective, I also measured the correlation between how well the charter networks perform and the number of letters in their names. That one is small too, but it's actually bigger than the link between performance and total donations received. What that means is that philanthropists have been scaling up California's charter networks more or less at random. If the same thing is happening in other states, that might explain why the networks are not outperforming independent charters. But that may not be the only problem. In order to open a new charter school, you have to be approved by an official agency. And sometimes that agency is part of the same public school system that will be competing to attract students with the new charter. It's like allowing athletes to eliminate certain players from the opposing team. That sounds like a classic conflict of interest. It gives authorizers an incentive to reject promising proposals. But surely that doesn't happen in practice.
We decided to start our first charter school in Massachusetts because at the time, the city of Springfield wanted to introduce some competition. The city was not performing well, and the superintendent saw that as an opportunity to bring in charter schools. We were selected to take over the second lowest performing school in the district. We opened as a K-7 school and grew over time to a full K-12 school. And we graduated our first senior class in 2001. And since then, we have been sending kids off with 100% college acceptance rates.
But despite its record of success in Massachusetts, a proposal to open a Sabis charter school in Brockton was rejected by the State Board of Education.
The motivation for rejection, no doubt, was political. We learned the hard way that in the charter movement, politics is very much part of the process. Unfortunately, it is not only about identifying a need and proposing a solution. There's a lot of politics in the mix.
Is that true? A good person to ask is Basan Nemberko, because a few years before he acknowledged that Sabis has a good educational model, he successfully campaigned to stop their proposed charter school from opening in his district. At the same event at which Nemberko praised the Sabis model, the moderator raised this question.
Why wasn't Sabis good enough for Brockton, whenever that was, 5 years or so ago? Why wasn't it good enough? Why wasn't that good enough for you to support them to come to Brockton?
My title was Superintendent of Brockton Public Schools. So right off the bat, there's an enlightened self-interest involved in that. Basically, the issue was finance, and politics. Had nothing to do, or very little to do, with the quality of the program. SABUS came, and we saw that as a threat, simply a financial threat to us. If it took money away from us, which was about $4 or $5 million based upon that, our progress would have been substantially affected. So my job, defending the Brockton Public Schools, as a superintendent, was to do whatever I could to stop that particular threat at that particular time. So we mounted a very good political campaign.
SABUS's experience in Massachusetts is hardly unique. In fact, public school officials not only prevent promising new charter schools from opening, they sometimes shut down successful existing ones. In the spring of 2014, the Los Angeles Unified School District decided to close 2 high-performing charter schools serving low-income Hispanic students. The reason was that the charters had opted not to use the district's own special education services. Instead, they chose an independent service provider that was already working with 300 other schools, something they had every right to do under California law. So why did the district want to shut them down? According to County School Board member Douglas Boyd, the district has been trying to blackmail charter schools into using its own special education services, shutting them down if they refuse, because it wants the money that the state attaches to each special needs child. Fortunately for these 2 charter schools and the children they serve, the County School Board overturned the district's decision. But no one expects the district to stop trying to get what it wants. One of the most striking cases of a district voting to shut down high-performing charter schools played out in Oakland, California. As a whole, students here perform far below their peers in the rest of the state, and the district has its own armed police force. But over the course of a decade, one of Oakland's worst schools was gradually turned in to the highest-scoring school in California. It's called the American Indian Public Charter School. For the past 6 years, it has ranked among the top middle schools in California, and it's part of a small network that includes a second middle school and a high school, both of which are also in Oakland and also among the top performers in the state. And that's not because of their demographics. Every racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic subgroup of students at these schools easily outperforms its statewide peers, and all of them beat the average for wealthier white students. The high school has topped the Washington Post's list of the nation's best. All of its students take advanced placement courses, and they score remarkably well on the year-end tests administered by the College Board. How do they do it?
The fact that the high school classes and the 8th grade classes too can be so productive, that's entirely predicated on what happens in 6th grade.
That's where it's the roughest adjustment. So we get kids from neighboring, elementary schools. They come in, and I think it's a shock to them their first 3 weeks, maybe month and a half. And it's about acclimation, and it's about this is how you conduct yourself at this school.
There's a student contract, there's a code of conduct for students, and the parents and students are required to review it and sign it prior to applying. And it helps because the students know exactly what's expected.
When I came here in the 7th grade, I was failing. So yeah, it was really hard for me to get used to it. It was just a really big transition because the school that I went to, they actually gave me a textbook and put us in the back of the classroom to learn and teach ourselves.
I've actually experienced some of this. I'm the tutor at the downtown campus, and I usually do one-on-one sessions with some of the students that are struggling. And most of the students that I've tutored actually just transfer in from different schools. Some of them are like at a 4th or 5th grade level where they should be at a 9th or 10th grade level.
I was nervous going into 7th grade because I knew I was going to be getting new students. There's just a lot to catch up to in terms of like the workload, just the school culture, and then just, behavioral adjustments. But because the core group of students that I'd had since the beginning of 6th grade was so well behaved, new students just kind of adjust.
In some schools, children may not try adjusting because the teachers don't try. If they don't do a couple of assignments, the teacher won't mind because that's just one less for the teacher to grade. But I think at this school it's more, they're not like attacking, but they're more on you and what you do.
When it comes to like catching them up on academic stuff, I'll take on that extra work if it means that student, makes the progress. So after school tutoring, in school tutoring, before school tutoring, taking them aside during class time and working with them one-on-one, because that's the other good thing about having really well-behaved classes is that the students can work independently, and that really does free the teacher up to work one-on-one with the students who do need help.
Usually, this school, people may feel that though the workload may be stressful, but they get used to it. And the fact that our school creates a sense of community, that sense of community in itself motivates us.
The thing that keeps the school together is definitely the teachers.
And I feel like the students kind of accept after they've seen so much that they can do, that they accept the fact that these teachers are doing something right.
But in the spring of 2013, the Oakland Public School District voted to shut down all 3 American Indian charter schools. They based their decision on alleged financial improprieties by the school's former administrator, who had retired the previous year. The schools responded that he was no longer affiliated with them and that they would address any shortcomings in their accounting practices. They also emphasized that while they received less per-pupil funding than district schools, they prioritized instructional spending and paid their teachers higher salaries. The district refused to reconsider its decision, and so the schools filed suit to overturn it. For over a year, they struggled under this legal cloud. Their previously rising enrollment stalled. Finally, in the summer of 2014, a state court ruled that the district had broken California law in deciding to close the schools because it had not given enough weight to their students' academic success. That sort of opposition would certainly stifle the growth of good charter schools, but it doesn't seem to be a problem here in New Orleans, where support for charter schooling spiked in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. When the storm hit in August of 2005, it closed every school in the city and damaged most. It took 6 weeks for the first school to reopen, a small Catholic school in the French Quarter called Cathedral Academy. The staff there had to make hundreds of calls to track down students who'd been scattered to other cities and other states. Cathedral Academy not only opened its doors to its own students, but also to those of another Catholic school that had been more badly damaged by the storm, having sat under 10 feet of water for weeks. The students attended in shifts, and the staff of both schools alternated management duties. Not every school was able to find places for its students within the city, but determined educators still found ways to keep teaching. 2 other Catholic schools, Cabrini High and Holy Cross, located a Christian school in Baton Rouge that was willing to host their lessons in the evening at no charge. So for weeks, the students made daily 3-hour round trips to Baton Rouge, returning home long after dark. Finally, after a grueling 2-month cleanup effort, Cabrini High itself was able to reopen. But not wanting to leave the students of Holy Cross in the lurch, it too adopted a shift schedule, minus the 3-hour commute. By November, 8 Catholic schools had reopened, but none of the public schools. And by the following May, 60 private schools were serving students, but only 25 public schools had reopened, and virtually all of those were charters. That wasn't lost on state and local officials, and charter schooling in the Big Easy was cleared for takeoff. Today, 3/4 of New Orleans public school students attend charters, a higher share than anywhere else in the country. And charters here are more likely to belong to networks. As a result, New Orleans is seen as a test case for charter school expansion. So, how is it working out? According to the researchers at Stanford, charter schools in Louisiana are outperforming traditional public schools. And that's particularly noticeable in New Orleans. The difference isn't enormous, but it's good news. But there is one disappointing element to the story. Networks of charter schools in Louisiana are actually performing slightly worse than independent charters. The best are not crowding out the rest, at least not yet. It's a similar picture to the one I found in California and that others have found nationwide. There's a lot of scaling up in the charter sector, but it's indiscriminate. If we want to find a place where the school's being replicated or outperforming the rest, we'll have to keep looking. Which is why we're headed to Casablanca. No, not that Casablanca.
Because you're getting on that plane.
Welcome to the Casablanca Valley, just outside Santiago, Chile. We haven't come here for the waters, or even the wines.
Su vino, señor.
Oh, thank you very much. We haven't come here just for the wines, but as long as we're here... Winemaking in Chile goes back almost 500 years, but in 1938, the government capped wine production, restricted the creation of new vineyards, and outlawed the importation of foreign machinery. Officially, the import ban was supposed to boost domestic manufacturing, but cutting it off from foreign competition actually caused it to stagnate. In the meantime, European vintners developed ever-improving wine presses, fermentation tanks, and bottling systems, virtually none of which made it to Chile. With so little consumer choice and competition, winemakers could put pretty much anything in a jug and sell it. At least they could until trade barriers were slashed in the 1970s. Suddenly, Chileans had access to wines from all over the world, which they promptly ignored in favor of newly available soft drinks and beer. Wine consumption fell off a cliff. That put Chile's wineries in a bind. Their domestic market dried up, and they couldn't export what they'd been making because it just wasn't good enough. For a few years, the industry was badly shaken. But then it stirred. With the trade barriers gone, Chileans could finally import the latest equipment, and new players could easily enter the marketplace. Even foreign investors were allowed to come to Chile to start joint ventures or launch labels of their own. One of those new labels was Le Pastole, founded by the makers of Grand Marnier liqueur and Chateau de Sancerre wines. Companies like Le Pastole didn't just bring a lot of foreign dollars into Chile, they also brought the knowledge of how to run a cutting-edge wine business. Some of that know-how is evident in the construction of Le Pastole's Cloapalta winery. Half of the 6-story building is underground for temperature control, and the wine flows from one floor to the next by gravity, eliminating the need for pumps. After the final barrel stage, the wine is bottled and shipped to 60 different countries around the world. In 2008, several of those bottles wound up in blind tastings by the Wine Spectator. Apparently the dump buckets didn't see a lot of use that day because Cloapalta was named the #1 wine in the world for the money. But the knowledge of how to make good wines at competitive prices didn't stay locked up in the vaults of foreign producers. It was contagious. As soon as these high-tech operations arrived around 1980, their techniques began to be copied. That international cross-pollination has spawned a whole new generation of wineries. So, over the last quarter century, both the scale and the quality of Chilean winemaking rose dramatically. But what does that have to do with education? Well, just after Chile opened up its wine industry to consumer choice and competition, it did the same thing for schools.
First, they decentralized public schools from the Ministry of Education to the municipalities. There are about 345 municipalities in Chile. And second, they introduced a flat per pupil voucher, which has since been differentiated. So parents can choose between a public or a municipal and a private voucher school, which are for-profit and non-profit. And the per pupil voucher follows the student to the school. The voucher is differentiated by a student's socioeconomic background characteristics. So when a school enrolls a low-income student, the school receives approximately 60 to 80% more per pupil than if they enroll a student from the middle class or upper middle class.
So, what did all those reforms accomplish? Did opening up the marketplace do as much for education as it did for the wine industry?
Chile spends about $2,000 per pupil in primary and secondary school. It's more than most Latin American countries spend. And Chile spends about 1/6 of what they spend in the United States per pupil in K-12. Chile outperforms all other Latin American countries that participate in the international tests, and Chile is the country that has showed the most improvement on the most recent PISA tests. Between 2000 and 2009, Chile's overall quality showed the most improvement. In 1990, about half of Chileans lived under the poverty line. Today, it's less than 15%.
Many people here and around the world have noticed these improvements, but not everyone is impressed. Large-scale student protests erupted in 2011, led most visibly by a college geography major named Camila Vallejo. Now a Communist Party congresswoman, Vallejo's central demand was that the government provide universal, free access to college. But the protesters also called for changes in Chile's system of elementary and secondary education. They demanded a moratorium or an outright ban on the creation of new private voucher schools, a ban on co-payments by parents, a ban on for-profit voucher schools, replacing local control of public schools with nationwide central planning, and even an end to school choice itself in favor of mandatory student assignment to schools by the government. Chile's young protesters believe that their nation's education system is shortchanging low-income families. According to Camila Vallejo, children who are born poor will receive a poor education and continue to be poor. But Chile's education outcome gaps between the rich and poor are actually smaller than those in most other Latin American countries, in some cases the smallest in the entire region. And Chile's education gaps are shrinking because the students at the low end of the performance range are improving faster than those at the top.
Chile's improvement is mainly explained by the improvement of the lower income students. So there's been a closing of the achievement gap over the last 10 years. And this is reflected on international tests and also on national tests.
Another way to measure educational outcomes is the number of years of schooling that students complete, called educational attainment. By that measure, Chile has the lowest level of educational inequality of any country in Latin America. As for income inequality, it is high in all developing countries, but that's been shrinking in Chile too. And several teams of researchers have attributed the improvement, in part, to its system of public and private school choice, which just happens to have been introduced during the 1980s, under the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. And there's the rub. Regardless of its success, Chile's education system is tainted in many people's eyes because it was favored by a brutal dictator. That's understandable. But should we condemn something solely because it appealed to a tyrant?
Here comes a car.
Okay, now watch me. I'm going to use number 1. Keep your eye on that thumb, baby, and see what happens.
One of the biggest box office hits of 1934 was the romantic comedy It Happened One Night. It swept the Academy Awards and is still delighting audiences nearly a century later. It was also one of Adolf Hitler's favorite films. The fact that Hitler liked the movie doesn't make it any less charming, nor does its charm make Hitler any less hateful. It doesn't make sense to judge one based on the qualities of the other. Under President Hugo Chavez, Venezuela introduced a curriculum whose central goal is to promote the official government ideology. All public and private schools must follow it or be shut down. The government acknowledges this by name as indoctrination, but maintains that it is necessary to eliminate capitalist ideas. And they might be right, but that's not one of the goals that the Chilean people ever mention in public opinion surveys. What they really care about is academic quality.
Parents choose private schools partly because they think the schools are going to respond to their preferences. So the school owners listen to parents. Parents feel that they have, a more active voice in the schools. Private schools have more flexibility in hiring and firing teachers, recruiting good teachers, firing poorly performing teachers.
Of course, not all private schools perform well, but most studies find that they outperform Chile's public schools after controlling for differences in the students and families they serve. An even more interesting finding is that competition from private schools actually improves the performance of nearby public schools. But the extent to which public schools improve as a result of competition depends on how tightly their budgets are tied to their enrollment. All government funding for private voucher schools is based on enrollment, but that's not the case in the public sector. In some municipalities, public schools are given substantial extra funding regardless of the number of students they serve. When that happens, those public schools don't improve as much in response to growing competition. Makes sense. They don't have to improve to remain financially viable. A second crucial discovery researchers have made about Chile is that chains of private schools have a large advantage over independent mom-and-pop schools. On top of that, the larger school networks perform even better than the smaller ones. Successful private schools grow.
This is a very key difference between the public-run system and the private-run system. In a privately run school, what we would do is take advantage of that opportunity and we will expand the school. We will invest to grow. And from having 1,400 students like here, we'll go to 2,000. We will purchase a site the next door and build a new building, you see. But in the case of a public-run school, who might be interested in something like that? The principal doesn't have the money, the scope, he cannot influence, that runs through another system. But this doesn't mean that the public run don't do anything. You know what they do? The good teachers from those schools start giving private lessons. So large schools like the Instituto Nacional, which is a famous public school, we should ask ourselves, how come don't we have 30 Institutos Nacionales all over the country, all over the Santiago? Because you don't have the incentives. The people who have developed and conserved and run the Instituto Nacional don't have the incentives to duplicate the Instituto Nacional, but they do duplicate their personal earnings by giving private lessons.
But the research on the role of incentives and entrepreneurship has not been widely discussed in Chile. The public conversation here has been dominated by the demands of the country's young protesters. And since the protesters helped to bring the current government to power, its policies naturally reflect their views. In the spring of 2014, the Chilean government proposed banning tuition co-payments by parents, re-centralizing control over public schools at the national level, and outlawing for-profit private voucher schools. Not everyone thinks that these ideas have been carefully thought through.
People will feel the impact if they do ban for-profit schools. 1/3 of families send their children to for-profit schools. If they ban for-profit schools, 1 million students are going to have to find a new school. And I think it's unfortunate because I think really what we need to be doing is focusing on guaranteeing access to high-quality schools, improving the quality of our teaching force, and other reforms that are going to are much more likely to have an impact on improving the quality and equity of our school system. However, I think that when the politicians start to talk about banning for-profit schools, if you talk to school owners, they stop investing. They think that they're going to lose their school.
We had the plan to develop and build many schools, but as you probably know, the public politics and orientations in Chile are not moving in that direction. It's moving in the direction of more public schools. We have some sites already selected to build new schools, but we have decided not to.
It's very hard for nonprofits to get loans from the bank to kind of expand operations. So nonprofit schools that don't belong to like a religious organization or a large foundation run by a wealthy individual, it's very hard for them to actually get money for the bank and expand their operations.
Basically, the school's owner that you interviewed is right. Therefore, we have uncertainty. Obviously, it's not just happening to this school's owner, but also to all the school owners around the country. We're waiting for the new policies to see if they are going to keep investing. Logically, if the current policies change, the owners are going to stop working and they are going to start selling schools. In fact, there are cases where that is already happening.
We can still hope that Chile won't abandon the policies that have brought it such academic and economic success, but even if it does, it has already taught the world a great deal about replicating educational excellence. What makes Chile so exciting is that its most successful educators are building networks of schools, and the better they are, the bigger they grow. Professional freedom, consumer choice, and competition are having the same beneficial effect in education as in winemaking. The catch is that the increasingly uncertain future of Chile's parental choice program is discouraging the growth of school networks. And we're still left with a couple of nagging questions. Why do growth and quality go hand in hand in Chile? And even if we figure that out, how do we know that model could be replicated in other countries? One way to answer those questions would be to find that model working in a totally different place. Maybe somewhere like...
On the final episode of School Inc., Andrew Coulson continues his personal exploration around the globe to discover the secrets to educational innovation. In Sweden, lessons of the past provide a warning for educational policymakers today. And in India, a population explosion sparks something dramatic in their educational landscape. With so much at stake, can we ride the wave of innovation and replicate educational excellence on a scale never before imagined?
Major funding for this program has been provided by Rosemarie and Jack R. Anderson Foundation, Prometheus Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Gleason Family Foundation, the Stephen Lana Hardy Foundation.
School Inc. is available on DVD. For more information or to order a DVD of this program, call 1-800-876-8930 or visit www.freetochoose.net.
In the modern world, we ride the crest of a wave. Every day, innovators discover new and better ways of meeting our needs. The greatest innovations are routinely replicated worldwide, except in education, which has remained stubbornly at anchor while the rest of the world has sailed past it.
That modern world is growing at an unprecedented pace. India now has more children than any other nation on earth, and so education has become a priority. Here, even though public schools are free, many poor Indian parents pay to send their children to private schools. Their reason is clear.
I spoke to one father who transferred his daughter from the private to public and now back to private. He told me, if you go to a market and are offered free fruit and veg, they'll be rotten. If you want fresh fruit and veg, you have to pay for them.
And in Sweden, a handful of schools are breaking the mold and turning modern trends upside down in pursuit of educational success.
Well, when you're looking at how many students want to get access to our school, it tells me that we're doing something right.
And in New Orleans, local educators think they are doing something right by investing time and resources into the charter school movement in the Big Easy. Join us as Andrew Coulson explores the challenge of replicating educational excellence in School Inc.
Major funding for this program has been provided by Rosemarie and Jack R. Anderson Foundation, Prometheus Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Gleason Family Foundation, the Stephen Lana Hardy Foundation.
Here in Chile, 30 years after the passage of a national school voucher system, students outperform those in all other Latin American countries, and private schools remain a vital part of the system. But what appears to have worked in Chile may not work elsewhere. There is one other place where we can see it working. Sweden! 10 years after Chile reformed its education system, Sweden followed suit. All private schools are now fully tax-funded, and parents can easily choose between these so-called free schools and the local public schools. Before the program began in 1992, private schools enrolled barely 1% of students. Today that's up to 16% and still rising. But are Swedish test scores going up as fast as Chile's? Actually, they're falling. Swedish math scores dropped like a rock from 1995 to 2003 and continued to fall, though more slowly, after that. Here's the thing. Back in 2003, public schools still enrolled 96% of students. So it's the public schools that drag down the national average. So the only way that Sweden's school choice program could be responsible for the country's academic collapse is if competition from the few new private schools sent public schools into a tailspin. But according to the latest research, the opposite is true. The more private sector competition Swedish schools face, the better they perform. Okay, then what has been hurting public school achievement? It's a tough question, but here's one possible cause. The share of college students applying to teacher training programs has plummeted over the past quarter century, and their academic ability has fallen with it. Back in the 1980s, there were 10 applicants for every open space in Swedish teachers' colleges. By 2012, there were so few applicants that nearly all of them were accepted. College admission in Sweden depends in part on a multiple-choice scholastic aptitude test. Guess every answer and you'll score about 20 out of 100. The average score for students in colleges of education was just 25 out of 100, which means many of them scored worse than if they'd circled answers at random. But why have so many high achievers given up on teaching? It might have something to do with a dramatic change in the culture of Swedish schools. Reforms introduced in the 1980s and 90s de-emphasized academics and shifted control from teachers to students. Today, nearly half of all students in Stockholm report that their studies are regularly interrupted by their peers who routinely ignore the teacher and chat on cell phones and social media during class. Both the public and private sectors have been affected by this cultural shift, but at least some of the private schools are bucking the trend. A network called IES, or International English Schools, emphasizes academics in a calm, respectful atmosphere. Students must behave courteously, address teachers as Mr. or Ms., and follow a conventional dress code. All of which is illegal. But the principal seemed disinclined to knuckle under.
Our schools believe in discipline in the classroom. Our schools believe in high expectations for the children. I say to our principals, we stand up for who we are. We tell the parents, this is what we expect. We talk to the students also. This is what we expect from you. This is, after all, a workplace. And after all, you have a choice. If you don't like our rules, there are places where you don't have to abide by rules.
Founded in 1993, IES now operates 24 schools serving nearly 18,000 students, with an additional 30,000 still on its waiting list.
When you're looking at how many students want to get access to our school, it tells me that we're doing something right, that we have the right people in place.
Given that success, I asked Barbara Bergstrom if she thought the government should require other schools to emulate IES's methods.
I don't think so, because I believe it's the choice that people are having. That's important. What we do is of great interest to a segment of the population. It's not, one size fits all. I think the issue of choice is the most significant one.
And Swedish parents have a lot of choices. Another of the country's popular chains, Kunskapsskolan, takes an entirely different educational approach.
So we organize our subjects into steps and themes, and all the steps and themes are found on the Learning Portal. And the Learning Portal is accessible to students, teachers and parents. You can use it on any device, from an iPad or a smartphone, or from home, anywhere you are. So you can study French on the bus if you want to.
Kunskapsskolan's individualized model gives students considerable autonomy, but it doesn't leave them unsupervised.
As a teacher, I have 3 roles in Kunskapsskolan. I'm a subject teacher, I'm a general teacher, I'm there for all the students, and also I'm a personal coach. And I meet every student for 15 minutes a week. I think that our flexible way of organizing time and our space gives me more room to create the different kinds of sessions that I think my students need.
Like IES, Kunskapsskolan is expanding, even internationally.
We have in Sweden about 40 schools and about 10,000 students. We started in London 3 years ago, and in London we are now running 5 schools. We are growing at the pace where we can keep quality.
IES and Kunskapsskolan could hardly be more different pedagogically, but both are well liked by the families they serve and academically successful. And if neither model appeals, there are hundreds of other independent schools to choose from. But here again, not every good school grows. This is Individual High School. It scores well academically, its students regularly win awards, and it has a very illustrious list of alumni, a list crowned by Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Victoria. But like a typical American prep school, it has never grown beyond a single location. And the fact that it's now part of Sweden's school choice program hasn't changed that. Why do some great schools add new locations in response to rising demand, while others don't? Is there even a pattern? Well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that there is a pattern, and it's incredibly simple. Yay! There's a single feature that separates independent schools that scale up from those that don't. The bad news is that that feature is the profit motive. Here's the thing. Lots of people don't like the idea of for-profit education. And if it isn't widely accepted, it won't be widely adopted. And great educational options will remain out of reach of millions of kids. While popular nonprofit schools grow slowly, if at all, their for-profit competitors form networks like IES and Kunskapsskolan. But there's still another possibility. Maybe the correlation between for-profit status and growth is just a coincidence. Monthly ice cream consumption goes up and down with the murder rate, but there's no reason to think that frozen treats actually make people stabby. Is there any reason to think that the profit motive actually causes schools to grow? Or, looked at the other way, does nonprofit status discourage growth? The answer is risk. If new locations fail, they can drag the entire enterprise down with them. Donors to nonprofits are unwilling to assume that risk. They give to sustain a tradition, not to jeopardize it.
I believe that all entrepreneurs that succeed, they are being driven by the goal to change something. Profit is a receipt to show that you've done it in a successful way, but its primary aim is not, hey, let's make lots of money. The primary aim, let's make sure to do something that people like. And if they don't like it, we won't make money. And that's an important consideration that sometimes is forgotten.
It really does seem as if the profit motive plays an essential role. But that's just half the story. Entrepreneurs only earn a profit if they make good decisions. If they make bad ones, they suffer losses. To understand just how important that carrot and stick system is, it helps to look at a case in which the stick was missing. This is the Vasa. Launched in 1628, it is the oldest surviving ship in the world. Gustav Adolf II, the Swedish king who commissioned it, spared no expense. It ended up costing almost 5% of the entire Swedish national income. Construction lasted over 2 years, and just a few months before the Vasa's launch, it was subjected to a routine stability test. 30 crewmen lined up on one side of the deck, and then they ran back and forth across it in unison. But after just 3 iterations, the admiral overseeing the test called it off because it seemed the Vasa was about to capsize. Naturally, the ship was redesigned and retested before being put into service. Didn't happen. Actually, the Vasa was launched as is, and on its maiden voyage, it sailed 1,200 meters into Stockholm Harbor, heeled over, and sank, killing about 50 of its crew. That crew, of course, did not include the admiral. He made his bad call from the safety of the shoreline. Entrepreneurs, on the other hand, go down with the ship. And that puts a limit on the amount of risk they're willing to take. It also limits the amount of damage they can do if they're completely clueless. Companies that consistently make bad decisions continually suffer losses until they run out of money and credit and fail. And when decision makers don't pay for their mistakes, they have less incentive to make well-informed decisions. That's what led to the disastrous launch of the Vasa. The shipwright only had experience working with a single gun deck. The king decided he needed 2. His Majesty also called for more and heavier cannons and masses of elaborate oak carvings, all of which made the ship less stable by raising its center of gravity. Which raises an important question. Was it really wise of the king to substitute his preferences for the judgment of the shipwright? We might well ask the Swedish government the same question today with regard to schools. They aren't telling educators they need more cannons or oak carvings, yet, but they are telling them how and even if they can do their jobs. For example, the government forbids teachers from grading their students' work until they've reached middle school. It has also begun requiring all private schools to hire the graduates of its official teacher training programs, even though everyone admits that these programs are attracting the country's weakest college students. The government even prevents new private schools from opening in places where it thinks they would attract too many students, outcompeting the local public schools. In these and other ways, the Swedish government imposes its own decisions on schools without having nearly as much at stake in the outcomes as the educators who actually run them. Like King Gustav Adolf and his admiral, the government officials are making their calls from the safety of the shoreline. Standing next to Sweden's most famous preventable disaster, it's hard not to think that history is about to repeat itself. If there were no regulations at all, wouldn't some private schools try to take advantage of families? And wouldn't the most likely victims be children whose parents had little schooling themselves? If so, we'd be most likely to see it in a place where private schools are serving a relatively disadvantaged population. I know just where to look. Here in India, a lot of schools are taking advantage of poor families. Back in 1999, a team of researchers made surprise visits to schools around the country. In village after village, they found one type of school that consistently had the worst facilities and the least learning. Most had leaking roofs, and barely any had drinking water. And if you're wondering why anyone would pay for that kind of service, it turns out there's a good reason. They have to. The findings I just described are for public schools.
That is what happens in the government schools. The teachers, from what I have seen from my experiences, that teachers, not all teachers really work and they give education. I have seen teachers sitting and chatting, and I've seen children roaming around in the school rather than being in the classes. So that's the basic difference. There isn't anyone who's going to be held accountable.
I met this lady recently at a social gathering, and I said that, oh, so what's been going on with you? And she said, oh, I managed to get a government job. My life is set. And I said, well, set in what ways? She said, well, I'm never going to be fired. This is a job for life, and it pays me well, and I don't even have to go. And I said, how does that work? You don't even have to go. She's managed to find somebody a bit influential in the Department of Education locally, and the guy has asked somebody to fill in her attendance every single day. So she hasn't been to school for the last year and a half since she was posted there.
That's not to say that all public schools in India are dysfunctional. There's one network run by the federal government that's very highly regarded, but spaces are limited, and 3/4 of them are reserved for the children of government officials. But what happens to poor children who can't get into an elite public school or afford an elite private one? That's a question that British education professor James Tooley found himself asking when he came to Hyderabad on a research trip.
So one day I took a auto rickshaw from my hotel in Banjara Hills, a nice part of town, down to the Charminar, where I'd read in my rough guide to India, the slums of the old city lay behind this Arc de Triomphe, if you like, of Hyderabad. And I found something which changed my life. It was one of those wonderful moments where I found a private school, a low-cost private school. In those days, charging the equivalent of about $1 per month. I found one, and then a second, and a third. And soon I found this federation of low-cost private schools.
When Tooley revealed his discovery to other education experts and government officials, they were a tad skeptical.
They said, calm down, Tooley. Calm down. What you found, and I remember this, what you found is a couple of businessmen ripping off the poor. And anyway, it's only happening in Hyderabad in India. We know about it. It's a small thing, And I thought, ripping off the poor, but that's not what I've seen there. I've seen dedicated entrepreneurs who are running schools. They come in on their weekends and run science fairs and sports competitions. When you see one or two schools in poor areas, you think, okay, this must be charity. Maybe the mosques are supporting them. Some NGO, some non-government organization is supporting them. When you see 5, 10, 15, and you hear of 500 of these schools, you realize that can't be the case. There has to be a financially sustainable business model. I talked to a lot of parents. I said, you're poor, Why are you spending money on the private schools when the government schools are free? I'll never forget. One said, in the government schools, our children are abandoned. And sure enough, I went to see one of these government schools, and I'll never forget this. 130 children sitting on the floor. It's a government school just around the corner from here. 130 children, all bright-eyed, eager to learn, eager to welcome this stranger in their midst, doing nothing, abandoned.
Dozens of scientific studies have now looked at these budget private schools in India and elsewhere. And what most of them find is that private schools are outperforming government schools that spend 3 or 4 times as much per pupil. But higher quality isn't their only appeal. Another huge factor is the language of instruction. India has hundreds of native languages, and the public schools in each state usually teach in the dominant local language. Private schools, on the other hand, almost always teach in English because that's what parents want. And it isn't hard to see why. English not only facilitates communication between states, it's also the international language of business. And international business has taken a keen interest in Hyderabad. During the 1990s, barriers to foreign investment were lowered and high-tech companies flooded into the city. The explosion in high-tech employment has generated new service and professional jobs in which English is also an asset.
When I first came to Hyderabad, I was quite naive about these things, and I spoke to one of the first school proprietors, one of the first entrepreneurs I met, and he told me that the government inspectors, the education inspectors, come 3, 4, 5 times a year. I thought, well, that shows a degree of commitment on behalf of the government to educational standards. But I soon found out that they came really to take the bribe. You know, they were quite upfront about it. They came, they sat in the office, they sat in a comfortable desk, they took the money, they didn't even bother to look in the school. They had a nice cup of hot chai, and off they went.
The reason that government school inspectors are able to extort bribes is that these low-cost schools cannot afford to comply with the regulations. For example, the law demands that each school have a large playground. But in the dense slums of Hyderabad, spaces like that are hard to come by.
Land prices are atrocious. How can a small entrepreneur, afford something like a 16,000 square feet of sports playground? I think there's a lot more important basic thing that we need to get on with rather than playing sports. They can always go home and do other things, but they need to learn the basic literacy first. I think what's more important is what goes on in a classroom, what happens with the instruction, what about the learning outcome.
The regulations in India are much more onerous to private schools than they are in other parts of the world. This inhibits investment, this inhibits entrepreneurs creating opportunities, this inhibits the growth of the sector. One of the first entrepreneurs, again, I spoke to here, he said, sometimes government is the obstacle of the people. And I understood exactly what he meant when I saw the regulations that were impeding on the private schools here.
But if regulation doesn't explain the greater efficiency of low-cost private schools, what does?
We've had some wonderful parent meetings in the schools here. These parents care about their schooling. They said, why are there only 10 computers? Why was a teacher absent last week? Why is the playground not finished? They care. They are paying money. They feel it's good money. It might seem very little to you and me. It's good money to them. They want the best. And because they're paying, they will keep the schools accountable. That's a very important thing, which you mess with at your peril. And I spoke to one father who had transferred his daughter from the private to public and now back to private. He told me, if you go to a market and are offered free fruit and veg, they'll be rotten. If you want fresh fruit and veg, you have to pay for them. I'll never forget that. That was his experience of free public education. He thought paying was better. He thought the accountability kept the schools on their toes in a way that couldn't possibly happen in the public schools.
In my school, if we said 9:30 is the time, so there should be a 9:30. If they come 9:31, there is a late mark. After 3 late marks, they will lose one day's salary.
At fee-charging private schools, parents expect more because they're paying more. So they hold school leaders accountable. And school leaders, in turn, hold their teachers accountable because they'll go out of business if they don't. By contrast, public schools here almost never fire teachers for poor performance or absenteeism. Enrollment in fee-charging private schools is growing at 10% a year. And if that continues, they'll soon enroll the majority of students nationwide. In cities like Hyderabad, they already do. It's great that these schools perform better at a fraction of the per-pupil cost of state-funded schools. But there's still a lot of room for improvement among them, and wide variations in quality from one to the next. So are the good ones scaling up?
Mohammed Anwar, he's typical. He's got a heart. He provides scholarships named after his father for a percentage of the children in his schools. There's no reason why philanthropists, well-meaning people, can't do that sort of targeted assistance to help the poorest of the poor come to schools like this and really help them get an education.
By 2025, my growth may be up to 50 schools and about 15,000 students. So this is my target. But at present, I am focusing on improving quality education.
In an effort to expand access to education among India's poor and lower castes, the government passed the Right to Education Act, or RTE, in 2010. Under the new law, the government requires private schools to reserve 1/4 of their places for disadvantaged students and pays those students tuition. At the same time, the law demands all private schools meet extensive infrastructure and teacher certification requirements. But as we've seen, low-cost private schools cannot afford to meet these requirements, which would force them to quadruple their tuition fees, according to one estimate. Since that would put them out of reach of the poor families they serve, it's just not an option. The result, in many states, the government has begun to shut down thousands of low-cost private schools. But quality control isn't the only justification for regulating schools. Some people worry that if educators are free to teach whatever they want and parents are free to choose among them, that it might balkanize communities into warring factions. But is that true? Does diversity have to mean discord? To find out, we need to head back to a town where cultures have been colliding for hundreds of years. When people think of New Orleans, they often think of Mardi Gras, a celebration inherited from the French, who ruled Louisiana during most of the 18th century. The French got the idea from Roman Catholics, who in turn got it from Roman pagans. Among the most popular paraders are the Mardi Gras Indians, comprised of African Americans who wear costumes inspired by Native Americans. Music, of course, is a big part of Mardi Gras, especially jazz, which was born in New Orleans from African roots, European instruments, and a dash of Spanish influence. You can still see some nice Spanish architectural touches in the city's French Quarter. All of that to say, if you're looking for a cultural melting pot, New Orleans is a pretty good place to be. Now, let's say you add to this melting pot a dollop of school choice, a program that lets families choose from among a host of public and private schools that teach different values and religions. Would all heck break loose? That question came up in 2002, when the U.S. Supreme Court was asked to decide the fate of just such a program in Ohio. Vouchers worth $2,500 were offered to low-income families who could redeem them at public and private schools, including religious ones. That freedom of choice gave pause to Justice Stephen Breyer, who feared that it would create conflict in a diverse society like ours and tear our nation apart. Two other justices shared Breyer's reservations, but the majority decided to uphold the voucher program. It wasn't that they necessarily disagreed with him, they just thought his concern had no bearing on the constitutionality of the program. So the question remains, were Breyer and the other dissenters right? Does giving families a wide range of educational choices cause conflict? New Orleans is a good place to answer that question because a voucher program was introduced here in 2008 and expanded statewide 4 years later. As expected, most of the schools were religious. What wasn't expected is that one of them turned out to be Muslim. For some legislators, that was a deal breaker, and they were pretty candid about it. One said that she liked the idea of providing parents with a choice between public schools and Christian schools, but that she did not support public funding for the teaching of Islam. Another said that he opposed any bill that would provide funding for Islamic teaching, saying, "I won't go home to my people and explain I voted for this." Within a few days, the objectors got their way. The school withdrew its application, not wanting to be the center of a heated debate, and its withdrawal caused the controversy to subside, at least temporarily. As a result, the statewide expansion of the voucher program was enacted. And as it happens, the participation of non-Christian schools is not the only source of controversy under voucher programs. Another bone of contention is the teaching of science, especially biology. The dominant theory among biologists is that life on Earth evolved through a process of genetic mutation, natural selection, and random chance. And that theory has itself evolved over time as generations of scientists have updated Charles Darwin's ideas, producing what is now known as the modern evolutionary synthesis. That's how science works. Someone comes up with a theory that makes testable predictions. Others try to falsify it, either wholly or in part. Theories that fall short are discarded or revised in order to better reflect reality. Science is a process for successively approximating the truth. Theories that survive gradually gain wide acceptance among experts, and the modern evolutionary synthesis is one of those survivors. But while science doesn't promise absolute truth, religion often does. For instance, most evangelical Protestants see the Bible as literally true. This means that they believe humans and other animals did not evolve over millennia, but rather were divinely created in their present form. This creationist view is commonly taught in evangelical schools, and many of them participate in Louisiana's voucher program. If you're a parent looking for that sort of instruction, it's a congenial arrangement, but not everyone is enthusiastic.
I grew up in Louisiana, where we have a law called the Louisiana Science Education Act. This law allows the critiques of evolution to be taught with supplemental materials that have no oversight. And the purpose of this, I mean, say this is to promote critical thinking, which sounds great. But the problem is they also say critical thinking is teaching creationism. I think everyone should have a good science education, but if you choose to send your kid to a private school without public funding, they can learn creation if you want. But anywhere where there's public funding, we should teach reality.
That is a common refrain among critics of creationist voucher schools. The public shouldn't have to pay for that religious instruction. It's hard not to admit that Justice Breyer was onto something. The participation of religious schools in voucher programs has led to tension and conflict. But what Breyer seems not to have recognized is that these very same battles have long been raging in our public schools. Some have only been minor skirmishes, but other cases have been, well, cases. One example is the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial of 2005. Parents in Dover, Pennsylvania sued their public school district to stop it from teaching creationism in biology class. Those parents eventually won, but battles over public school biology instruction are still erupting around the country. Given how much we fight over our schools, with or without choice programs, it might seem as though there's nothing we can do about it. And yet, diversity doesn't always cause discord. There's one field that's been bringing together people of different races, cultures, and religions for generations, and producing harmony instead of acrimony. That field is music, and in particular, jazz. In the 1930s, it was illegal in many states for black and white musicians to share a stage, and segregation was the norm even where it wasn't enforced by law. But the musicians themselves ultimately overturned America's artistic apartheid. A decade before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in professional sports, pianist Teddy Wilson and vibraphonist Lionel Hampton joined the Benny Goodman Quartet, playing to packed houses around the country. Miles Davis later did the same thing by hiring the white pianist Bill Evans to join his famous sextet. Not to make a point, just because he liked the way Evans played. If music can create all those culture-bridging triumphs, why not schools? Could there be a way for us to promote parental choice and educational diversity without creating endless conflicts? To find out, it may help to go back in time to the place where those conflicts began. St. Augustine Church in Old Town Philadelphia. It's a beautiful building, but on a human scale, which is probably why it's played host to everything from society weddings to feature films. But the appearance of St. Augustine has changed quite a bit over time. 169 years ago, it looked like this, and a few months later, like this. The original St. Augustine's Church was burned to the ground during the Philadelphia Bible riots of 1844. By the time the smoke cleared, 25 people were dead and another 100 injured. If the idea of Bible riots sounds odd, the reason for them will sound even odder. Reading the Bible was mandatory in public schools, but each Christian sect had their own version of the good book. Protestants had the King James Version, which was required reading, but Catholics were only supposed to use their Douay version with its annotations and interpretations. Philadelphia's Catholic bishop tried to diffuse the situation by suggesting that either Catholics be exempt from the mandatory readings or that they be allowed to use their own Douay Bible. And some Protestant ministers began suggesting that the bishop wanted to remove the Bible from public schools entirely. Unruly protests followed. Those protests became mobs, and mobs became riots. It was America's bloodiest conflagration over religion in public schools, but the same tensions could be found all across New England. In Maine, Bridget Donahoe was expelled from her public school for refusing to read from the King James Bible, and her priest was stripped, tarred, and feathered for putting such ideas in his parishioners' heads. And in Boston, an 11-year-old boy named Tom Wall was caned for a solid half an hour for refusing to read from it. Just as in Louisiana, publicly funded religious schooling created social tension and conflict. But there is a difference. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld vouchers because they leave the choice between secular and religious schooling up to parents. But in 19th century Pennsylvania and Maine and Massachusetts, there was only one government school system, and it was Protestant. That sounds an awful lot like the sort of establishment of religion prohibited by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Why didn't those Catholic families sue their school districts? Well, they did. They just lost. Fortunately for us, Old Town Philadelphia is a good place to find out why. This is Carpenter's Hall. It's played a lot of different roles over the years, from bank to banquet hall. It was even the home to Benjamin Franklin's library company. And in 1774, it was the site for the First Continental Congress. When the Second Continental Congress met 2 years later, they formally declared that independence. And a dozen years after that, the Constitution of the United States was ratified. But though a majority of delegates supported the new Constitution, a third voted against it. One of the most common complaints was that it lacked explicit protections for individual rights. The critics got their way a few years later, however, when the first 10 amendments, what we now know as the Bill of Rights, were adopted by the states. There are only 3 things that Thomas Jefferson wanted mentioned on his tombstone: that he founded the University of Virginia, and that he was the author of both the Declaration of Independence and Virginia's statute for religious freedom. That statute declared that no one could be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever. In the preamble to his Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, Jefferson wrote that,
"To compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical."
What if that is the underlying cause of America's endless school wars? Not the diversity of our ideas, but the compulsion to pay for those we disagree with. Yet that's precisely what's been happening for the past 150 years. Everyone has been compelled to pay for a single official system of education. So naturally, everyone has wanted it to reflect their own views and reject those they oppose. But in a society with so many contradictory views, that's been impossible. The only way for one group to win has been for another to lose. Hence our endless battles over what is taught in public schools. In the last years of the 18th century, Catholics in Philadelphia were still very poor. So when 2 Augustinian friars came to the city to build a church, they had to cast a wide net in order to raise the necessary funds. One of their main donors was the sitting President of the United States, George Washington, a Protestant. Washington's gift caused no public outcry. In fact, St. Augustine's returned Washington's ecumenical favor when it became a hospital for stricken Protestants during the cholera epidemic of 1832. Wouldn't it be great if we could harness that same spirit of philanthropy in education? One way to find out is to visit a place where it's already happening. This is the Lehigh Gorge Scenic Railway, about an hour north of Philadelphia. Back in George Washington's time, it was just starting to be explored by coal miners, and a community was founded here in 1818 called Mauch Chunk, meaning mountain where the bears are. Some things have changed over the years. The town is now known as Jim Thorpe, but for the most part, people here are happy to keep that 19th century flavor. Here in the woods of central Pennsylvania, there is one 21st century innovation that has taken root, which the locals seem to like.
When it was brought to our attention that this tax credit was enacted, I thought it was too good to be true. And most of the money is an expense that we would incur anyway in the form of taxes. So it's always nice to be able to direct your dollars where you'd like to direct them.
It's called the Education Improvement Tax Credit. Businesses can donate money to any of a number of charitable scholarship organizations. Those organizations help low-income families pay tuition at schools the parents choose. Pennsylvania's Scholarship Tax Credit program operates in small towns all across the state, but most of the students it serves are found in big cities like Philadelphia.
I take donors into schools a lot, and it's very unlikely that you leave any of these schools without saying, "How can I help?" We have had a really high 90% retention rate with companies who've given to us. We obviously have school fairs to help them choose, but it's you know, as long as the school is accredited by the state, then the families are empowered to choose what school works best for their kid, and the scholarship follows them. If they don't like the school, they can go to another school.
The major limitation of the program is that the state has capped the total value of donations that are eligible for tax credits.
With the current situation, even the school district is interested in partnering on the QT with us because they're closing failing schools.
I always say we have no stake in this game as an organization. Our job is to just get scholarships, get them to kids who don't have access to them. And so if they mechanically made it easier and they removed the cap, I think the programs would explode in size. I think you'd see them 3 or 4 times the size. And what I think you'd see is the quality of education, even in some of the non-public schools, would even get better.
It sounds as though the program would grow dramatically if the tax credit cap were raised or removed. In fact, we can already see that happening in the state of Florida. What's different about Florida's program is that its cap is automatically raised every year, so long as there are more families and more donors who want to participate. In just a few years, the program doubled in size to nearly 70,000 students. Subsidizing education through voluntary philanthropy seems to offer a lot of freedom to parents and donors. But what about teachers? And how could we even measure the difference? I don't know about you, but I could use a beer. Maybe I should rephrase that. The beer itself is not going to help us answer this question, but a technique developed by a master brewer actually will. Enter William Seeley Gossett, a young chemist at the Guinness Brewery in Dublin, Ireland. Gossett's job was to improve the beer without having to raise the price. That meant doing experiments to identify things like the best ingredients. But those experiments took time, and they cost money. So Gossett had to figure out ways of extracting useful conclusions from just a few small-scale studies. The company was so keen on his efforts that it gave him a year-long sabbatical to research statistics in London. Their decision paid off. Gossett developed a technique for drawing conclusions from very small studies, making statistics a useful and affordable way for Guinness to improve its products. For instance, presented with 2 shipments of hops, Gossett could tell if one was better than the other by testing just a few samples, and he knew how confident he could be in his results. The company was so impressed by Gossett's breakthrough that they didn't really want other breweries to learn about it. Nevertheless, they let him publish his work anonymously. Gossett chose the alias Student, so his technique became known as Student's T-test, and it's still used by scientists all over the world. In fact, that's why we're interested in Gossett. His test can help us answer our question about regulatory differences between vouchers and tax credits. As this chart illustrates, the difference is substantial. Joining a voucher program is expected to more than triple the amount of red tape educators have to contend with. That's a much bigger burden than the one expected for participating in a tax credit program. One reason for the difference might be that tax credit programs, like the one in Pennsylvania, rely on voluntary private funding. No one is forced to donate to a scholarship-granting organization, and anyone who does can pick the organization that receives their funds. It's a system that is directly accountable to both donors and parents, so there's little incentive for piling on regulation. Vouchers, on the other hand, are public dollars. All taxpayers have to pay for them, and yet they have no direct say over how those dollars are spent. As a result, some legislators feel they must use regulations to control how vouchers are used. Unfortunately, as we saw in India, Chile, and Sweden, those regulations are not always helpful. In most countries, we not only make it cumbersome to operate an individual school, we make it hard for innovators to scale up successful ones, much harder than it is to replicate excellence in other fields. That's kind of a big deal. How big? And that's why we've come here to the outskirts of Manchester, England. Because this is where the wave began in the late 1700s. This was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. And it's where the American Francis Cabot Lowell learned how to build a water-powered textile mill from the people who first developed them. And yet, the most dramatic thing about the Industrial Revolution is not the machinery, but the transformation it caused in the standard of living. For the first 200,000 years of human history and prehistory, the average person survived on $3 a day, or less. In 1798, a Brit named Thomas Malthus famously described this problem and claimed that the population would always rise faster than the supply of food and other resources, so the standard of living could never rise. Ironically, Malthus was absolutely right about the way the world worked right up until his own generation. In the 2 centuries since, the world's population skyrocketed. According to Malthus, that should have led to global starvation. Instead, the standard of living rose even faster than the population. In the countries that caught the wave early, average incomes shot upwards by a factor of more than 30, from $3 a day to $100. That is the real wave, a tide of innovation so colossal that it swept away the Malthusian population barrier. After 200 millennia of stagnation, sustained progress in human welfare finally became the norm. And it all began here in the United Kingdom in the mid-18th century. So what was Britain's secret ingredient? There's no shortage of theories. Was it a higher savings rate, international trade, exploited workers, colonialism, greed, modern science, the Protestant work ethic, railroads, canals, and on and on? There have been dozens of possible explanations offered since people started to notice the wave. Until shortly before the Industrial Revolution, earning a living was scorned by the elites of every society on Earth. If you worked your hands, you were beneath the notice of dignified people. And if you ran a business, you were beneath their contempt. The widespread loathing of entrepreneurship has to have made opening a business less appealing. If all that hostility prevented the rise of the Great Wave, it's terrible news for education. After all, running a business that earns money educating kids is still widely despised today. Consider the case of Reed Hastings, the founder and CEO of Netflix. After college, Hastings joined the Peace Corps and went to Swaziland to teach high school students. In the 1990s, while he was hatching the idea for Netflix, Hastings also took graduate courses in education because he wanted to understand why schools were lagging while other fields were leaping ahead. Sound familiar? Since then, Hastings has given millions to educational charities, but has decided not to start an education business. He told a reporter he didn't want people to think he was doing it for the money. So education can have some of Hastings' charity, but it can't have his entrepreneurial leadership. But outside of education, that attitude started to change around the year 1600. A new way of talking about commerce appeared alongside the old one. Shakespeare himself was a transitional figure. In addition to casting characters who fit the old negative mold, he introduced a few who shattered it. His Comedy of Errors, for instance, is full of business people who are basically nice. They're polite, they honor their contracts, and they don't try to cut chunks out of each other. In the years that followed, favorable references to commerce appeared in English plays, essays, and novels. Many of them are now forgotten, but others not so much. If this little bungalow looks familiar, it might be because it was featured in the television adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. As with most of Jane Austen's books, it is filled with pompous gentry who sneer at anyone who works for a living. But in Austen, those are the bad guys. For instance, the conniving Bingley sisters mock our heroine, Lizzie Bennet, for having an uncle who's a merchant. But though he works in Cheapside, they're not criticizing him for being poor. Cheapside is an actual street in London, and in Austen's day, it was an upscale shopping district. The Bingley sisters mock Lizzie's uncle because he earned his money in trade, instead of getting it the right way, from a dead relative. That opportunity for entrepreneurs to earn people's respect, says economist Deirdre McCloskey, is what caused the great wave of innovation that raised the standard of living worldwide by a factor of 10, a factor of 30 in the nations that adopted it early. She doesn't argue that mundane economic factors like financial incentives, competition, and consumer choice were unimportant, just that they were insufficient. But is she right? It's too soon to say with confidence, but one thing we can say is that her theory meshes well with the story of education. Then as now, education was perhaps the only field in which successful entrepreneurship was not celebrated, and so did not flourish. Where it has begun to thrive in modern times, it is only in exceptional places where resistance to education as a business has lessened. But even if McCloskey does turn out to be wrong, we're still left with a choice in how we think about people who work for a living, whether it's digging ditches, running a shop, or building a school network. A choice between, say, Jane Austen's snobbish Bingley sisters or her open-minded Lizzie Bennet. Who do we want to be? What if we allowed all education entrepreneurs to put their own money on the line in an effort to better serve us, gaining or losing based on their successes and failures, just as entrepreneurs do in other fields? And what if we made sure that everyone had access to that wide open marketplace? Would we then see excellence scale up in education?
Andrew Coulson's exploration began in a one-room schoolhouse in 18th century New England and has taken us on a journey across the globe, seeking answers to the question, why can't education use innovation to grow like a successful business? We have met inspirational teachers in unlikely places and have seen a unique approach to learning in South Korea, where students put a personal premium on competition. And we've seen how new educational ideas have lit the flame of learning in places like Chile, Sweden, and India. But the question remains, what will it take for educational excellence to ride the wave of innovation that improves the outcome for everyone?
Major funding for this program has been provided by Rosemarie and Jack R. Anderson Foundation, Prometheus Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Gleason Family Foundation, the Stephen Lana Hardy Foundation.
School Inc. is available on DVD. For more information or to order a DVD of this program, call 1-800-876-8930 or visit www.freetochoose.net.
And then a funny thing happened. People kind of liked it. Within 2 years, Sony had sold 1.5 million Walkmans worldwide, sparking similar products from other companies that sold millions more. But that was just the beginning. Every year or two, new and improved models hit the market. To earn enough to buy the original Walkman, you had to work 2 weeks at a typical minimum wage job. And that was for lo-fi sound on cassettes you had to flip over every half an hour. What's really amazing about the rapid spread and improvement of personal audio players is that it isn't amazing at all. It's perfectly normal. Great new gadgets and services are appearing and going viral every day. A decade ago, no one had ever heard of Google. Now they do tens of thousands of internet searches per second. Facebook went from 0 to 500 million members in just 5 years. And the same thing is true outside the high-tech world in everything from organic grocery stores to disposable diapers. Basically, invent something good, and it gets big. And these days, it gets big fast. But of all the products we make and the services we provide, there's one that stands out as an exception to that overall pattern. One activity in which excellence doesn't spawn countless imitators or spread on a massive scale. And that exception is schooling. For generations, there hasn't been a single innovation in teaching that has transformed classrooms and improved student achievement worldwide. The closest thing to it can be found here, inside this 19th century schoolhouse. Let's have a look. And here it is, the blackboard. For the first 2,000 years of education history, it was hard for teachers to communicate complex visual information to groups of students. Wax tablets, like the one shown in this Greek vase painting, had been around since the 5th century BC, and that's how children learned to write, etching letters into the wax, rubbing them out, and starting over. Useful as they were, they didn't allow teachers to reach the whole class all at once. 20 centuries later, we'd made the great leap forward to these, slate tablets and chalk. Bit of an improvement, certainly they're easier to erase, but it wasn't until the late 1700s that a Scottish schoolmaster named James Pillins had a really clever idea. He took all of those tablets off of students' laps and he hung them together on the wall. Suddenly, every student could see exactly what Pillins was talking about at the same time. In a flash, the blackboard leapt across the Atlantic to the United States Military Academy at West Point. And just a few decades later, it was a common item even in remote rural schoolhouses, like this one. So there's an example of a brilliant educational idea, simple and effective, that took the world by storm in barely a generation. We know it can happen. But that was 200 years ago, and nothing quite like it has happened since. Why haven't our classrooms been transformed by that same pattern of improvement and innovation that we take for granted in every other aspect of our lives? It's not that we haven't tried. Schools have adopted all sorts of new technologies over the years, from projectors to personal computers to smart whiteboards. The trouble is that none of these new inventions has improved outcomes, measurable outcomes, on a global scale. Let's take a look at something. American test scores at the end of high school have been flat since we started keeping track of them all the way back in the early 1970s. And the same thing is true in most. That parent power came at a price, literally. If you sent a child to public school in the early 1800s, they sent you something that looked like this, a bill. Local education taxes were levied so that the poorest students could attend at little or no charge, but everyone else was expected to pay tuition fees. In fact, half to two-thirds of common school budgets came from these fees. Since the public schools weren't giving education away for free, parents had an incentive to hop in the carriage and check out what the private sector competition had to offer. And they liked what they saw. Most students in the early American Republic attended private schools. Some of them were large academies enrolling hundreds of students, but many were also run by individual teachers. Anyone who wanted could put out a shingle and solicit paying pupils. And finding them was easy. You could just open up the local paper.
Miss Boardman informs her friends and the public that her spring term for instructing young ladies and misses commenced on Monday, March 11th. Terms for instruction in reading, orthography, chirography, arithmetic, geography, astronomy, English grammar, rhetoric, composition, history, and plain needlework. $8 per quarter.
$8 for 3 months. Still, that wasn't pocket change in the 1820s and 30s, but there were teachers offering instruction for less than half that amount. There were also private school options for the poor with free and reduced price tuition. Those were run by mutual aid societies, religious groups, and tradesmen's guilds. And unlike today, many of the larger private academies received public subsidies, allowing them to reach a wider audience than they otherwise would have been able to. Competition helped too. Just as the opening of the Middlesex Canal put pressure on the Pawtucket Canal operators, the creation of all these new, small, independent schools forced the larger private academies to lower their tuition fees. This jumble of competing private schools didn't use the same textbooks or methods, but it seems to have been effective. Student enrollment and literacy were high and rising, newspaper readership was exploding, and the standard of living was improving from one generation to the next. None of this was lost on Horace Mann or his friend James Carter. It was Carter who spearheaded the creation of the State Board of Education from his seat in the Massachusetts legislature. But before Carter ran for public office, he ran his own private school. He'd seen their growing popularity firsthand. And like Horace Mann, he worried that the common schools were lagging badly. In fact, Carter wrote for the Boston Patriot newspaper that unless something was done,
the academies and private schools will be carried to much greater perfection than they have been, while the public free schools will become stationary or retrograde.
Faced with that prospect, Carter and Mann devised a plan to ensure that every child would have access to the dynamic private education marketplace. Okay, I might have made that last bit up. What they actually did was to try to get everyone out of the private sector and into the common schools. That sounds a little odd when you think about the way they felt about common schools versus private schools as far as performance went, but when you understand the way they thought about parents and government, it begins to make sense. Carter, in particular, thought that the reason private schools performed so well was that elite parents chose them. So if he could get those same elite parents to send their kids to the common schools, well, problem solved. Much as they respected the educational decisions of the nation's elites, they had a pretty dim view of the average parent. Referring to young children, Carter had this to say:
Their whole education, if it may be called by that name, is drawn from parental examples, which are not always the best, and are oftentimes the most corrupt.
Both men thought that it was wisest to take control of education out of the hands of parents and place it into the hands of state-appointed experts. And to meet that demand, factory owners had to find thousands of workers willing to take on grueling 12-hour days and 6-day weeks. As it turned out, girls and young women flocked to fill these new factory jobs. In 1836, a mill girl named Hannah Wilson wrote to discourage her friend Mary from coming to Lowell in search of factory work.
I think you're better off where you are.
for there's more girls than you can shake a stick at the Lawrence Corporation. Holly Thompson has gone to doing housework at Doc Hubbard's. She can knock it in the factory nowhere in Lowell.
Still, the mill owners couldn't rest on their laurels. In order to stay profitable and to stay ahead of the competition, they had to find new ways to boost productivity. And that's why the clever chaps at the Appleton Mill hired an eccentric, vegetarian, teetotaling engineer named Uriah Boyden. They asked Boyden to build them a couple of new improved water wheels. Nothing brilliant about that. The clever part was to promise Boyden that the more efficient those wheels turned out to be, the more he'd get paid. Well, with an incentive like that, Boyden did what any good engineer would do. He started by copying off the smartest kids in class. Boyden studied the latest French water power systems, called turbines, and then modified their intakes and outlets to bump up efficiency. His design performed so well that it blew the old technology out of the water. In the coming decades, mills around the country ripped out their medieval-style water wheels and replaced them with ever more efficient turbines. Productivity just kept rising, and the innovations behind it spread like wildfire. The cost of manufactured goods steadily fell while quality continued to improve. It was the dawn of the American Industrial Revolution. Which brings us back to the reason we visited Lowell in the first place. From our vantage point at the beginning of the 21st century, it certainly seems as though great new ideas and innovations were already scaling up 200 years ago, and that with the exception of the blackboard, education just wasn't keeping up. Not everyone required the benefit of historical hindsight to see that. One man in particular noticed it at the time. He was born in 1796, the same year that the Pawtucket Canal was completed. Became a lawyer, was elected to public office, and eventually served here in the Massachusetts State House as president of the Senate. His name was Horace Mann, and this is how he saw his state's fledgling public school system in 1837.
As the system is now administered, if any improvement in principles or modes of teaching is discovered in one school, instead of being published to the world, it dies with the discoverer. Now, if a manufacturer discovers a new mode of applying water or steam power, the information flies over the country at once. The old machinery is discarded. The new is substituted.
Sound familiar? Like us, Horace Mann was frustrated that the common schools, as public schools were then known, weren't enjoying the same spread of innovation that he was seeing happen all around him in places like Lowell. And so he resolved to do something about it, to find a way to make educational excellence go viral. In 1837, Mann closed his law practice, resigned his seat in the state legislature, and became the first head of the first state board of education in the country. From that position, he changed the course of American history. But to understand the plan that he came up with, we first have to understand what education was like during Mann's time. There were common schools all across New England. But there was no state or federal authority dictating what they taught or who could teach. It was parents who hired the teachers and often picked the textbooks as well. In fact, to save money, families sometimes billeted the teachers in their own homes. So if little Johnny couldn't read, figuring out why might be as easy as walking into the next room. But all most other countries as well. Basically, educational quality has been stuck in the era of disco and leisure suits for 40 years. While the rest of the world has passed it by. Classrooms and clothes look a little different now than they did back then, but we've changed the trappings of education without really improving the substance. The best schools haven't grown and taken over the less successful ones. The best teaching methods haven't been replicated on a mass scale. And while our top athletes and pop stars reach huge audiences, our greatest teachers seldom reach more than a few dozen kids at a time, despite all our technological advances. Why not? That's the question at the heart of this series. Why doesn't excellence scale up and spawn imitators in education, the way it does in other fields? We'll travel the globe in search of an answer to that question, and we'll take a few detours along the way, because the shortest route isn't always a straight line. But maybe we're just being impatient, and if we wait a few years, education will catch up to the pace of progress in other fields. After all, the rapid spread of new technologies and ideas, that's an incredibly recent phenomenon, isn't it?
To find out, we've come here to Lowell, Massachusetts, because in 1821, it didn't exist.
A local map from that year bears the title, A Plan of Sundry Farms, etc. at Pawtucket. For miles south and east of the Pawtucket Falls, this was just agricultural land, incorporated into the nearby town of Chelmsford.
The one notable man-made structure was this, the Pawtucket Canal. It bypassed the falls and the rapids below. It allowed lumber and other products to be transported down the Merrimack River from its headwaters in New Hampshire all the way to the shipyards of Newburyport on the Massachusetts coast. Completed in 1796, it was a pretty sweet racket, generating a steady revenue stream from its toll fees. At least it did until 1803, when a more popular competitor opened for business right next door. So the Pawtucket Canal lost its monopoly, and a lot of its business and revenue along with it. As a result, this whole area remained a rural backwater for a generation, population 200. Until, in 1821, something happened that changed all that. This!
The owners of the Pawtucket Waterway sold their entire operation, lock, stock, and canal, to the Boston Manufacturing Company. Its founder, Francis Cabot Lowell, had studied textile factories while living in England. Studied a little more closely than their owners seemed to realize. And thanks to his, well, industrial espionage, Lowell was able to recreate a functioning mechanized mill just outside Boston. The machines were powered by belts connected to rotating shafts along the ceiling. Those shafts, in turn, were driven by a massive flywheel in the basement.
And in the early 1800s, the way you got one of those great big flywheels up to speed was with one of these. The same kind of water wheel that had been driving grain mills in Europe since the Middle Ages.
And that's why, after Francis Lowell's death, his partners brought his mechanized mill design to the Pawtucket Falls. It offered enough power to drive dozens of these wheels. Other entrepreneurs took a chance and followed their lead, and the newly incorporated town of Lowell quickly went from rural backwater to the biggest manufacturing center in North America.
Their gamble paid off. Making cotton textiles in automated factories was faster, cheaper, and more precise than doing it by hand. So demand went through the roof. But there was a catch. In order
In the modern world, we ride the crest of a wave. Every day, innovators discover new and better ways of meeting our needs. The greatest innovations are routinely replicated worldwide, except in education, which has remained stubbornly at anchor while the rest of the world has sailed past it.
In the next hour, policy analyst Andrew Coulson explores why our classrooms have yet to be transformed by a similar wave. The same kind of innovative wave that has revolutionized and improved every other aspect of our lives. We crisscross the globe in our search for answers to the essential question, how do we attain educational excellence? In the Barrio neighborhood of East Los Angeles, a uniquely gifted teacher becomes an unlikely hero, showing his Garfield High School students how to shatter expectations.
He taught us to be strong and to stand up for what you believe in.
Time, 3 seconds.
But the same drive and determination that fueled Jaime Escalante's unparalleled success with the students of Garfield High also proved to be his downfall.
He was setting a precedent.
A lot of the teachers were resentful, and it was very public.
5,000 miles away, in a very different culture, Andrew Coulson finds an amazing similarity in the competitive spirit of a baseball game and and what students must do to get into college.
In my case, I stay up all night before exam, maybe during 6 weeks.
Here, in Seoul, South Korea, the fierce competition for entrance to the very best colleges, paired with cutting-edge technology, has propelled a unique educational industry to soaring heights. 95% of all South Korean students attend intensive after-school tutoring sessions called hagwons.
It is a market, like it is an entire market, and the consumer, a student, likes the product that is better than any other. So teachers compete within the market to become like entertaining and educative at the same time, you know?
For the last 10 years, my whole lecture revenue is over $100 million.
Isolated examples of success and innovation do occur in education, but seldom have such examples been expanded or scaled up to improve the educational systems that serve the masses, that improve the basic quality of life, that lift people out of poverty. Join us as Andrew Coulson explores the challenge of replicating educational excellence in School Inc.
Major funding for this program has been provided by Rosemarie and Jack R. Anderson Foundation, Prometheus Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Gleason Family Foundation, the Stephen Lana Hardy Foundation.
It's often said that education is different from other fields. And there's one respect in which that's certainly true. But to really see it, we have to stop and step back in time to the late 1970s. Recognize this? It's the original Sony Walkman introduced in 1979, the first mainstream personal music player. And on the eve of its release, the Japanese media were in solid agreement. They thought it would flop. Sony itself expected to sell only about 5,000 a month.